Everything begins with a person opening their eyes, as if they had just returned from a journey of horror. When the protagonist wakes up, they can only open their eyes. They are lying in a hospital bed. Feeling pain and struggling to move, they slowly manage to sit up. Looking around at the other beds, they notice that they are empty. The window behind them is broken. Trying to make a greater effort to stand up, but too weak, they collapse to the ground. Debilitated, still connected to an IV, and suffering from severe nausea, they begin to vomit. Even an action that for many would be normal was extremely exhausting for them. Once again, they gather their strength, using the side of the hospital bed for support to stand up. Worried, they look around, hoping to find someone. There was no one there to help them. They themselves removed the needle that connected them to the IV. With their weak strength, they begin walking through the hospital and notice that the floor is in ruins. Reaching the hallway, they cannot understand the reason for the chaos. Upon reaching the elevator, they notice that it is not functioning. Perhaps there is no electricity. Barefoot, they decide to take the stairs to see if they can find someone on the lower floor. To their shock, the lower floor is just like the upper one. It looks as if a war has taken place in that place. The young person wonders what could have happened there. Tired and weak, they crouch by the water fountain, and they notice that there is water. They hydrate themselves a little. That's when something strange happens to them. It feels as if they sense the presence of someone nearby, but they begin to doubt themselves. Once again, they take the stairs, deciding to go back up to the floor where they had originally woken up. Checking through their belongings, they find their phone, but there is no signal. They look at the broken window and decide to check the city's condition from above. Agonized, they see that it is not just this building. The entire city is in complete chaos. Nothing seems to be working. The buildings are broken, cars are abandoned, and no one is seen on the streets. For a moment, this fills them with anger, not knowing what had happened. However, that presence from before catches their attention. Looking through the window, they see an elderly woman. She is walking while pushing a cart, accompanied by 2 dogs. That elderly woman struggles to push the cart along with her animals. She senses their presence and also looks in their direction. They, realizing they have been noticed, open their mouth to shout and call her attention, but after a moment of thought, they hold back. They do not know what has happened, but they know that their body is extremely weak. They fail to shout, and now they can barely stay on their feet. Weak, they collapse once again. They think about how they have no strength left in their body and wonder how long they have gone without eating. They begin searching the entire hospital, including the kitchen area, for something to eat. They find some vegetables that already seem spoiled, yet even so, their body does not accept them. They feel nauseous again and start vomiting. Weak, but for a moment, they think they hear someone. They start asking if anyone is there, if there is anyone who can help them. Still kneeling on the ground with a little bit of food in their hands, they try to eat again. They think that maybe a war had happened, and they have no idea what happened to their father, mother, or family. They have serious doubts about what transpired there. They do not even know how long they have been in that hospital. Their memories are vague, but they remember being in school and getting into trouble with some people. They remember being a target of bullying by some school bullies. They recall fighting with 2 of them, but then more and more appeared, which is how they ended up like this. They knew it was not very smart to mess with a school gang. They were just trying to survive all the harassment. They were coerced because they had failed to bring the money that would supposedly make the bullies leave them alone. They thought they should keep their head down because they could not fight them all. Deep down, they did not want to fight back, but the insults were more than they could bear. In their heart, they thought they should surrender, even if it meant begging for forgiveness. They knew they could not do much for themselves and should surrender as soon as possible. Not to mention, their leader was watching everything, and in his presence, the others became even more aggressive. And to their misfortune, it seemed that this time, they were determined to put an end to them. This protagonist was being beaten by 4 people at once. They were kicked, punched, and constantly struck in the ribs. They clenched their teeth as they endured countless blows, each strike landing with full force from all of them. And already near the protective railing, the protagonist of this story lost his balance, and unfortunately, he fell from a very high floor and woke up once again in a hospital bed. Very scared, his memories ended there, and he was determined to change the scenario. He got up and began changing his clothes, knowing that staying there wouldn't bring him anything. The length of his hair was already bothering him, a sign that he had spent too much time in the hospital. Maybe half a year or more. He thought that he should first look for people, and to cover his long hair, he put on a cap. He wanted to find his family but didn't know if there were still police officers or guards around. Leaving the hospital center and starting to walk down the street, he had no idea where to begin his search. So he started walking aimlessly and noticed that every place was equally destroyed. He thought there wasn't even a single spot that had been left untouched. The streets had become deserted. Cars were stopped everywhere, as if a major traffic accident had occurred, and the scene was the same in every direction he looked. Approaching a vending machine, he noticed they had all already been looted by people searching for food. As he turned around, he noticed the 2 dogs that had been accompanying a lady earlier, and the animals were uneasy with his presence, but he saw that the lady calmed them down. She, talking to the animals and feeding them, turned and noticed the young man. The young man, feeling weak, asked her if everything was alright because he wanted to talk for a bit. When he tried to say something to the lady, she handed him a package. Then she told him to be careful, to stay alive, and to find a place to hide. After that, she continued on her way, leaving the protagonist behind with his doubts. Looking at the package she had given him, he saw several canned foods and started eating. Since he was still unaware of the danger, he ate in the same place he stood, and nearby, a car approached. When he turned around after noticing the sound of the vehicle, he saw that someone was leaning slightly out of the car, waving to get his attention. Not knowing they were dangerous people, he waved back. The guy in the car seemed friendly, however, he got out of the car holding a baseball bat. The young man only wanted to understand what was going on, as he was still confused. However, he was met with blows. After hitting him with the baseball bat and stealing his food, the man even mocked him, saying he didn't think people like him still existed. The lady and her dog saw everything from a distance. As destroyed as the city was, it wasn't completely deserted, and it seemed like it was being monitored from somewhere by unknown people. As if stepping out of a portal wearing futuristic clothes, someone appeared in the room and observed the hospital bed where the young man had been. Someone watching the city thought they needed to find the student records. The protagonist remembered that before, he had been quite confident that he was a smart student. He didn't want to go back to school in any way. The world had turned into chaos, but that might not be so bad. While the lady's animals licked his face, he thought that his face felt warm. Dazed, he asked what had happened, realizing he was in the lady's hideout. She told him she had seen him at the hospital and asked if he knew what was going on. He asked if it was a war. The lady said he could call it that because the world had truly fallen into chaos. She commented that her pups were energetic and took a long time to trust anyone. The young man noted that they weren't very quiet. She explained that before they had been agitated. Now, not anymore. However, the dog Soja seemed to want to play a little with the young man. She wanted him to find a shelter, handed him a few things, and asked him to be careful. The young man wished she would come with him. However, she said her companion was out searching for food, and if he saw the young man there, he wouldn't be happy. Still, the young man, grateful, said he would return to repay her kindness. The lady said he had already repaid her, that humans were like seeds that grow to bear fruit. As he walked away with the bag she had given him once more, he left her behind with a heavy heart. Walking once again alone through the empty streets of a destroyed city, his stomach soon reminded him that he needed food. This time he was more cautious. He looked around to see if anyone was nearby and chose a quiet spot, far from any street or avenue where he could be attacked again. He walked slowly until he came across a shelter. As soon as he entered, he could see that there were many people inside, and they kindly pointed him in the direction of the receptionist. When he reached her, he said that someone had sent him there. She, bored, asked if he was new to the area, if he had been hiding somewhere and had now decided to appear. But she did not let him say anything. She asked for his name, age, and if he had an identification card. Searching in his pouch, he explained that he was a high school senior and wanted to know what day it was. She, serious, looked at Kang Yeon and replied that it was April 13th before continuing her work. He realized that he was no longer 19 years old. With the time he had spent in the hospital, he had already turned 20. The protagonist wanted to know if the phones and the internet still worked, and if they did, whether he could use them. Impatiently, she explained that only an analog communication system was currently in use. She pointed to where he should wait and told him that she would quickly call him back to finish filling out his file. As he moved to the designated area, he saw many people, including some children, as well as babies and the elderly. It seemed that life was slowly returning to normal. After spending the night there in the morning, the national exercise routines, common in that country, began. The receptionist led the exercises, asking everyone to strengthen their muscles for when things returned to normal. After staying in the refugee shelter for a few weeks, the protagonist began to understand the current state of the world. The shelter provided the essentials for survival. It was a relatively safe place, and as far as he knew, society had not completely collapsed yet. Kang Yeon could tell that life was slowly resuming, and everyone there seemed hopeful. Some of the refugees tried to pass the time by playing games to distract themselves. A scientist attempted to explain what had happened in simple terms, asking them to imagine that a piece of candy was the Earth. The small planet was rotating around the sun, minding its business in the galaxy. But suddenly, something struck it. He even simplified it further for better understanding. Then he explained that, as everyone knew, the world had endured 34 hours of continuous earthquakes, something never seen before. The most peculiar thing was that there were no major casualties. It was as if everything had simply been put on hold. In his explanation, it was as if someone had tranquilized the earth, something physically impossible. He thought that, even if some suspected an attack from other countries, it was simply not possible. And he noticed that everything had seemingly returned to the times of the Joseon dynasty, even considering the possibility of aliens. At first, Kang looked as if he believed in the possibility, but then he smiled, thinking it was a joke. The young man then returned to the receptionist and asked if there was a way to find out where his family was. She replied that she had no way of knowing. She only knew the people in the third refugee shelter. She told him that the internet was still not working. Until that form of communication was restored, there was no way to get information. In the middle of their conversation, the old radio seemed to pick up a frequency, and the girl tried to establish communication. Kang Yin was trying to speak with her to learn about his family, but she was busy. And at one point, she became very frustrated with school gangs interfering with efforts to restore normalcy. That was when he recalled the words of the elderly woman who had mentioned that students were causing trouble. She asked the young man to stay there so he would avoid running into the students and remain out of danger. She was referring to the school at the third roundabout. They had turned the highway into their own paradise. Feeling down, he returned to his place. But as long as he did not know what had happened to his family, things would not be resolved, and he thought that the elderly would be safer there than out on the streets. Checking the supplies in his backpack and adjusting his cap, he left the shelter. He was going in search of the elderly woman who had been so kind to him, passing by some bicycles. Noting that they were still in good condition, he checked one and started using it to move around. A little further ahead, he noticed that some students were cornering the old man who accompanied the kind elderly woman. That old man, in turn, was holding a crowbar, trying to defend himself from the juvenile delinquents. Seeing that the man was trying to defend himself and that his animals were fierce, they thought he was crazy. The old man commanded his dog, Rawachevsky, to attack the aggressors. The dog, baring its teeth, growled to scare off the boys, who shouted that the old man was insane. The protagonist's eyes widened. He could hardly believe what he was seeing, and in the background, it seemed like he was being watched. Something futuristic appeared to be observing the scene, and in particular, observing Kang Yin. The boys who had been driven away by the old man and his dogs were recounting what had happened. Meanwhile, a young man was trying to eat a piece of steak. They recounted that everything was terrifying, that the man was completely insane, and that the dog had tried to bite them. The young man, who seemed to be the leader, tried to chew as much of the protein as he could, but it seemed difficult to digest. Annoyed by the result, the professor complained that it was tasteless and rubbery. The leader made it very clear that he was not a student at that school, but an adult. Still frustrated, he stated that all the teachers ate meat because of them and that, at the very least, he should be a good cook. The professor explained that he had prepared it exactly as before, and everyone had said it was good. The young man became irritated and threw the tray into the air. Grabbing the piece of protein, he forced the professor to eat it. Another member of the group with spiky red hair told the professor that he should have cooked it better. After teaching the professor a lesson in manners, their leader questioned why they had returned empty-handed. The young men insisted on telling the leader about the danger they faced when they tried to stand up to that old man. Seong-chun listened silently and calmly until he saw a video from one of them, something he shouldn't have known about since he wasn't there. Following his instincts, he jumped onto the table and asked the young man if he was saying that he should do all the hard work. Pointing his gun at him, he warned him not to relax after giving such a weak excuse. He asked if his subordinate understood the situation they were in. The world had turned into a battlefield. After listening, the red-haired young man gave his opinion. He ordered the other to go with him this time. While they argued, the professor, who had been forced to eat the protein, was still trembling with fear. Their leader placed his foot on the table, unconcerned, telling his companion to stop complaining. Moving on to another location, the young man, out of respect, called the elderly lady grandma and was worried about her. He said he had come back after spending some time at the shelter and thought the streets were too dangerous. They should both leave with him. Meanwhile, the protagonist looked to the side and noticed that the old man was upset with the students. Being polite, he called the old man grandpa and asked him to come with him to the shelter. However, the old man became irritated and asked who he was and who had given him permission to interfere. The elderly woman explained that he was the young man who, despite being a student, was a very good person. Quoting Plato, the old man said that reality was created by the mind, and therefore they could change their reality. He told the young man that a person could only live by what they believed in. The young man tried to make him understand. However, the elderly woman was distressed and asked the old man to take the cart to the basement. He knew things wouldn't be easy. He grabbed a crowbar and his two dogs, Soja and Rovashevsky. The kind old woman explained to the young man that her husband had been this way since the first time they tried to leave. Having been constantly harassed and threatened, her husband tried to do everything on his own. The young man noticed something and looked out the window. they realized that the troublemakers from before had returned. The elderly woman was very worried about her husband and asked what they were doing. The young man said he would go outside to help. The troublemakers had returned, but this time, they had reinforcements. They were also heavily armed. The old man, tired of being pursued, commanded his dogs to attack through the power of philosophy. But that young man with spiky red hair was the most ruthless of them all. He struck the old man down with a blow from a baseball bat. Immediately, the dogs leaped to attack. Because the students outnumbered them, they managed to overpower the dogs, trapping them. Tasik, the red-haired young man, asked the old man where the stored food was. Lying wouldn't help. He already knew they had looted some markets. It was best to cooperate. The old man could hardly believe what he was hearing, but the protagonist stepped in between them. His intention was good, to defend the old man from those troublemakers. However, the red-haired young man recognized Kang Yan's presence. He was the one who had put him into a coma. Pointing his finger at him, he mocked the protagonist for having ended up in a vegetative coma. Fearful, the young man recalled when Zhang Xiaotian and his gang had chased him at school. He asked the old man to go back inside, saying he would handle the situation. However, his opponent asked if he had already forgotten how things ended the last time he tried to fight back. Kang Yan countered by saying that his opponent always fought with 2 or 3 people by his side. The red-haired young man felt offended, thinking that Kang Yan was underestimating his strength. The old man, inserting himself into the conversation, stood up, grabbed his crowbar, and declared that he would make sure they never came back. At that moment, the young man, now more focused on violence, struck the old man again as if swinging a bat. Young Kang, perhaps seeing the old man collapse, shouted to check if he was still alive. However, the red-haired boy assured him that old man, if he tried to attack again, would not be shown any mercy. Upset, the young man shouted at the old man, telling him to listen and go back inside. Then he moved his body as if he were about to throw an uppercut at his opponent. The opponent merely dodged and struck the protagonist in the stomach, causing immediate and intense pain as he doubled over. Zhang Xiaotian took the opportunity to stomp on him, and mocking, asked what had happened since he was no longer as confident as before. One of the guys who had joined in ambushing the elderly couple's home was holding the dog, so that the other 2 could beat the old man. The distressed elderly woman ran outside to try to defend her loyal friend. She asked the red-haired young man what he was doing and why he was being so cruel. He merely pushed the elderly woman, causing her to fall to the ground alongside her husband, who asked if she was okay. That kind-hearted woman looked at the boys with eyes full of sorrow, wondering why, instead of doing good, they chose to torment others. The shock of it all was too much for her, and she fainted in her husband's arms, leaving him in a panic. Crying, he asked what he was supposed to do, insisting that she was fine. She had to be since she had taken all her medications. Seeing that scene, the protagonist was filled with rage, and a sudden surge of courage took over his body. Even in his anger, he could not fight against the sheer malice of those who only wanted to spread harm. Zhang Xiaotian struck him several times with the baseball bat. He too was overcome by fury, and telling him that if he thought he could defeat him, this was all he would achieve. He spoke those words while repeatedly striking the protagonist's body with the baseball bat. He did it so many times that the young man stopped moving, and even his groans of pain could no longer be heard. Gradually, all that remained was the young man holding the baseball bat, the protagonist lying on the ground alongside the dogs. For a moment, the red-haired boy showed regret, realizing he had gone too far. However, he knew that if he hadn't done it, he would have suffered an even worse punishment. Shouting at his followers, he ordered them to hurry and search the elderly couple's home for food. The young men obeyed Zhang Xiaotian's orders and began rummaging through the house, searching for supplies. One of them glanced at the unconscious young man on the ground, while Zhang Xiaotian looked visibly exhausted by everything. A presence could be felt. Although everything seemed calm, a strange noise lingered in the air. A futuristic being was forming in front of the barn, until its figure fully materialized. It was the very same futuristic presence that had been searching for the protagonist in the hospital room. This entity was accompanied by what appeared to be surveillance equipment, constantly monitoring the events. Young Rina was a girl who attended the same school as the protagonist of this story. She was always seeking his attention, and no matter how much he tried to ignore her presence, it never worked. Rina always wanted to know how his classes had gone, and if he had done well on his tests, and whenever she saw his bruised face, she would ask if he had gotten into trouble. He always made up excuses because he didn't want her to find out that he had been beaten up again by a school gang. They were always together, even during meal breaks and school recess. And whenever she suspected he had been in a fight, she would warn him that she would tell his mother. She would say that he couldn't just go around getting into fights. He needed to stay healthy so he could marry her one day. Her presence in his house had already become routine, and she always used the excuse of borrowing notes to study. Not even at home could he escape her, as she was a close friend of his mother, who already treated her as if she were her daughter-in-law and gave her a lot of responsibility over her son. One day, Rina was at Kang Yan's house when his mother had to leave for work. Kindly, she told them that she had made snacks and left them in the fridge, reminding them to eat after studying. She also left instructions that they shouldn't fight, allowing them to spend a lot of time together studying. And in the middle of studying, she would sometimes just stop and stare at him, making him incredibly flustered. On this particular day, she suddenly got up and fetched a first aid kit to apply ointment to his wounds. He was amazed at how well she knew where everything was in his house. She simply said that it wasn't her first time there and that she was a good observer. Then she told him to stay still. While applying ointment to his wound, she said she wouldn't tell his mother that he had been fighting. She told him it was better to stay away from fights so he wouldn't get scars before getting married. She said he needed to take care of his body because his body belonged to her. Little by little, those memories faded from his mind, and his eyes regained their life once more. He looked around and saw that they were being tossed aside along with the dogs. While the old man was deeply worried about his wife, she wanted to know about the children and the student. Very saddened, he told her that the dog named Soja hadn't made it, and the other one was struggling to breathe. He said he had left the dog downstairs and asked what they should do to apologize for his stubbornness. Even though she wasn't well, the elderly woman was still worried about the animals and the young man. When she looked to the side, she saw him standing, holding the dog, saying it was still breathing. Attentive, he wanted to know how the elderly couple was doing after she had given him such a scare. After some time, he placed the elderly woman and her dog inside the cart she always pushed around. He was pulling it while the old man tried to help by pushing from the side. The task was not easy, but he felt his whole body trembling and burning, and he didn't know how it had happened. He couldn't breathe properly and had no strength, but he didn't feel like he was seriously injured. He told the elderly woman to hold on a little longer. They were almost there, and a doctor was waiting. She was going to be okay. He thought he was lucky. He was weak and didn't know when he had become this way. His thoughts tormented him, telling him he was a failure, crushed by his own weakness. He fought against the idea that he had become someone too weak to defend himself. Meanwhile, the sound of an airplane could be heard in another place. The young woman, young Rina, looked up at the sky with hope and spoke to the protagonist's mother. Regarding the low-flying aircraft, she wondered if they had spotted them from afar. The woman said that when she saw the helicopter, she felt a little safer. The girls simply listened in silence as the woman spoke, and when they noticed that the man in charge was arriving, they hurried to take the clothes off the clothesline as fast as they could. Leader Seong Chun was feared and hated by many people in that place. He noticed unusual movement in the bathroom and went to see what was happening. It was the red-haired young man. The leader was wondering when the young man would return since he already knew what had happened. That's when the young man asked if he remembered Kang Yan. Suspicious, he asked why he was bringing that up, but he didn't have the courage to continue speaking. So the leader told him not to say strange things. After that, the helicopter was already arriving, seemingly distributing supplies. He ordered him to join the others and grab some supplies. He said he was heading to the rooftop and didn't want to be disturbed. After telling him to wash his face properly and stop trembling, he began climbing the stairs. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough time for the two women to leave, and once again, the young man cornered young Ren. He noticed she had just taken the clothes down. They seemed damp, and he asked why they were dirty. He told them they should also wash the men's clothes since they smelled bad. The girl snapped back, saying they could wash them themselves. The young man argued that they were busy protecting the place and searching for food. He wanted to know why that girl thought differently from the others, who believed the place was safe. Without fear, she replied that he was the one who decided who was strong or weak, and that they didn't really know if it was safe outside. The older woman pulled the girl by the arm, asking her to leave so she wouldn't get into trouble with him. Watching them walk away, he adjusted the chair with his foot and sat down to gaze at the sky. Talking to himself, he looked upward and declared that he would protect that place. Meanwhile, several people rushed toward the helicopter to collect supplies. A young woman from the third shelter asked a young man, who seemed to be recording something, if he could watch the footage later. He explained that the recording wasn't very good, and that the only reason he was filming was to help repair the helicopter. If fixing the transmission systems became necessary, the radio system would be repaired first. Somewhat disappointed, she said she understood. After that, she bid farewell as the helicopter left the area. She thanked the shelter's residents for helping transport the food and assured them that she would keep the gates locked. After checking that the warehouse doors were secure, she was exhausted and left on her own. However, something caught his attention. When he looked, he noticed it was the young man who had disappeared and suddenly returned. He watched as Kang Yan threw punches at the trees. It looked like he was training in boxing. However, his entire body was wrapped in bandages from the bruises he had received after getting involved with the school gang. Training there alone, he thought his self-esteem was fake, a weak self-esteem caused by that incident. Now his body had become weaker. After being inactive for so long, he believed he was even weaker than before. Yet he continued exercising. He thought he was going crazy and that he might break himself. He felt like he was nothing at that moment. Just as he had been before, deceiving himself into thinking he was strong. But when he realized that was a lie, he became afraid. That was the moment he had submitted to others. He landed a strike on the tree for every memory that embarrassed him. There was the day he fainted, standing on the edge of death. That day, too, he had been powerless. It didn't matter if the world had turned upside down, because he himself had become nothing. Beneath that tree, throwing punch after punch, those were the thoughts running through his mind, all while being observed by the shelter's receptionist, who thought he was losing his mind. My watcher was a young man sitting down, flipping through a book. He looked incredibly bored. That was when Kang approached him, politely asking if he was the head of security for Wang Chang. Since she had asked him to come there, he was now standing before him, and the two of them remained still, watching. The seated man asked Kang if he had gone back to seeing the kind of war that made him look so nauseous. He mentioned that he had seen the young man before, dragging that cart. At least now, he looked better than before. Kang Yan commented that he had come there to help with supplies, but had no idea what he was supposed to do. The seated man said it was just a way to pass the time, just like what he was doing. After speaking with the man, Kang remembered the young woman who had given him good news about his parents. She told him they had been actively searching for him as well, but since the situation had been so terrible in the beginning, they had been forced to relocate to another place. They were safe. He thanked her repeatedly for looking into it. She told him it was nothing, but he kept expressing his gratitude. Then she told him that if he really wanted to thank her, he could do some work now that he had recovered. She mentioned that she had already spoken with the team leader and that he would be waiting for him at the warehouse. Kang asked if she could also look for someone else. Her name was Kwon Young-rin, and she was the same age as him. She assured him that once they had the proper radio equipment, she would check for updates from other locations. And now he was also there, bored, sitting on the stairs, watching people pass by. He noticed that everyone seemed to like team leader Kwon and cared for him deeply, even calling him brother. He didn't like that at all and demanded that they take the young man with them, as he was part of the team but hadn't been assigned any work yet. The older men asked Kang if he was feeling hurt and what was going on with him. However, he didn't want to go with the men who were bothering him. He decided to stay there, keeping watch alongside the team leader. Visibly exhausted, he asked the leader if he wanted to switch places so he could rest inside. However, the leader refused. He told Kang to go inside and leave him alone. Kang sat back down and continued observing. Then someone appeared and introduced himself as Wang Chang, 39 years old. Beyond that, he was a complete mystery. Startled by the man standing so close to him, Kang realized he had been describing the chief, given that he was still a newcomer. Kang wanted to know why the man spoke so little and seemed to be the only one responsible for guarding the area. The older man explained that the chief had appeared a few months after the global tremor. He never spoke about what had happened in the past and refused to engage in conversations with others. He ate alone and acted like someone who had given up on life. But 1 month after that, about 10 thieves from another district showed up heavily armed, driving a cargo truck. Everyone felt powerless, but the man who had spent a month saying nothing suddenly. In a moment of crisis, he stepped outside, asked what was happening, and took control of the situation. One by one, he put them in their place. It didn't matter that they were armed with bats. Everyone witnessed how he took them down, one after another, while continuing to move forward. And after everything was over, the commander tucked his shirt into his pants and said one thing. He told them they should at least pay for the food, and even after all this time, that hadn't changed. Then he continued telling the boy about the rumors. Everyone had their own theory about where that man had come from. Looking at the young man, he asked if there was anything in his story that had caught his attention. He said he wanted to write a story based on what had happened, but wasn't sure about the ending. Somewhere far away, someone was lying under a tree when another person approached. It was the red-haired young man calling out, questioning why, after days had passed since the helicopter arrived, the guy still hadn't done anything about it. He asked if he was expecting him to do the job for him. That's when the guy on the ground brought up the previous adventure, mentioning the elderly couple. The long-haired man lying on the ground, wearing a protective mask over his eyes, explained that the supplies were transported by an army and that he had to find the right moment. But the red-haired young man was already agitated and didn't want to wait any longer, shouting to get his attention. Jiang Mun-chan didn't like being disturbed and asked if the other had suddenly become an officer. Jang Tae-sik, despite being worked up and yelling at the guy lying down, couldn't get him to stand. Lifting his mask slightly, the man warned that if he got up, things would get ugly. He also wanted to know how long the red-haired young man planned to keep blocking the sunlight. Leaving their argument behind and returning to the shelter, the young protagonist wanted to check on everyone. The elderly couple he had brought to the shelter, he affectionately called them Grandpa and Grandma. He wanted to make sure they were okay. He told them he was going out to stand guard and would be back soon. Walking down the hallway, looking back, he saw one of the dogs following him and told it to go back and take care of Grandma. The dog didn't seem to understand why it couldn't come along, but in the end, The young man allowed it to follow him. Sitting on the steps, watching the head guard, he realized that after a few days, his emotions had settled. The turmoil within him had calmed down. The anger at being so weak was finally fading away. He looked at the woman who had taken on a motherly role for him and thought that things were okay. He wasn't sure what he could do. He figured he would live peacefully there for a while and later reunite with his family. He might even see his friend again, young Rim, since she was probably with his parents. Thinking this way, he felt at ease. He was startled when Wang Chang announced he was stepping away for 10 minutes and that the young man would be on watch. He said he understood and would do as he was told. Previously, he had always kept a close eye on everything. He constantly checked the doors and windows. Time passed, and he was not only growing bored but also feeling uneasy. He stopped for a moment to gaze at the sky. The moon seemed to capture his attention. That night, there were many bright stars, and he wondered if his mother could see them too. Maybe even his friend could see them as well, when something suddenly made his heart race. It was the sound of cars. When he turned his body to look, a truck speeding toward him nearly ran him over. The truck barreled forward at high speed, crashing into the gate and ripping off the chains and padlock. It all happened so fast that by the time he tried to get up, several people had already jumped out of a van and a truck. Stepping out of the smaller truck was the man who had been lying down earlier, still wearing his mask around his neck. He commented that everyone had moved quickly because they only had 2 minutes. He ordered them to start spraying fuel, and they even threw the liquid on Kang as well. It looked like they were forming a perimeter with the fuel. Jiang Mun Chan, expecting some kind of resistance, looked at the frozen young man and warned that things were about to heat up. As soon as the young troublemaker set the fire, all the protagonist could do was move out of the way to avoid getting burned. Outside the circle of fire, but still inside, the intruders were trying to break into the warehouse. They quickly began hauling out all the food that had been stored there for the shelter residents. There were many of them, and they were well organized. The young man, noticing that his clothes were soaked in fuel, decided to take off his jacket. After doing so, he lunged at one of the men who was carrying supplies. He knocked one of them to the ground, which immediately drew the attention of the others. He seemed desperate to stop at least one of them. However, luck wasn't on his side, and he was struck down by their leader, the long-haired man with the mask around his neck. Jiang Mun looked at the fallen young man and asked if he wanted to be a hero. The young man on the ground begged them to return what they had taken. He wanted them to give everything back because it wasn't theirs, and he was struggling to get back on his feet. The leader of the young men, placing a hand on his head, said he didn't like it when people started acting like that. He told the young man to simply stay on the ground. However, the young man began making movements as if he wanted to fight. Jiang Mun realized that he wouldn't understand, so he decided to teach him a lesson. He struck him severely. Being trained in certain martial arts, he quickly threw the young man to the ground. He warned that if he moved even a single muscle, he would eliminate him right there without a second chance. One of the guys informed them that they had finished everything, and the leader gave the order to leave. And just as he was preparing to leave, he felt something pulling on his leg. Looking down, he saw who it was. It was that same loser, begging them not to take the supplies and to return them. However, he told him that it was already over. Jiang Mun commented that the young man was persistent, but it was the perfect timing. He needed a test dummy. Reaching into his coat for something, he told him that he was about to feel something shocking, something he normally wouldn't experience. Before he could finish speaking, something was thrown at his head. It appeared to be a book. It caused a small cut on his forehead. Annoyed, he asked who had done that. The head of security spoke up, saying that it had been him, and began taking off his jacket, making his intentions clear. He then asked the protagonist if he really thought that the supplies were worth more than his life. Jiang Mun noted that he had heard about this man before and knew he was aware of his fighting skills. That was when the security chief asked if he was willing to fight him over this. He attempted to use the same move he had used on the young man earlier, grabbing him by the collar, trying to slam him onto the ground. However, the head of security asked if he was using judo and said it was easy to counter. He grabbed the young man's arm and immediately headbutted him in the nose. Then he warned the others that he would only say this once. He wanted them to leave and abandon the stolen crates. However, the long-haired young man wasn't ready to give up. He pulled a weapon from inside his coat. It was a stun gun, which he aimed and fired at the man in front of him, calling him an old geezer. As the man collapsed to the ground, he began kicking his body, asking what he should break first. However, that young man soon noticed a noise and commotion. Several people from inside the shelter started appearing. He quickly got into the small truck, ready to leave. The two vehicles drove off with all the stolen supplies, leaving the shelter empty. Several people gathered around the two fallen men, and a nurse was providing first aid to Kang Yan, who regretted not being able to defend the food, though none of them blamed him for it. The security chief, Wang Chang, reassured him, saying he had managed to buy as much time as possible. Meanwhile, in another location, the red-haired young man was grabbing a few cups when he noticed the others arriving. He asked if that was all they had managed to get. It was just utensils and decorations. The red-haired young man even joked with another one, saying that despite everything, he had still managed to get his face injured. Then he went to speak with the leader about what had happened. However, one of them asked him to wait a minute. Approaching him, he whispered that he had seen the guy he had beaten before, and that it seemed he hadn't finished him off. The guy, shaking, swore that on that day he had ended his life with that crowbar. Back at the shelter, someone was explaining to Kang that, since they had been robbed before, this time they had filled the warehouse with fake supplies and stored the real food somewhere else. The shelter receptionist asked Chief Huang if he was okay and said no one had expected them to have a taser. They commented that the young men must have found it in a police station. The girl, satisfied, announced that the emergency news channel was finally back online. They asked if there was an announcement. She said it would be in 5 minutes, and they rushed to start the generator. The news reported that given the current situation, there were still very few citizens in need of first aid. And as supply helicopters flew overhead, they also captured distress signals from Ingan School, which was currently occupied by an armed group and had been filmed by 2 people calling for help. Kang Yin watched that broadcast with sadness and realized that the ones sending the distress signal were 2 familiar people. Very familiar to him, his mother and his best friend were waving at the helicopter, making a request. That scene seemed to intensify, and the young man's condition worsened. At times, he couldn't even defend himself. At school, no one with red hair was sitting in what remained of a classroom. He thought about what he had done when he kept hitting until his strength ran out, watching Kang's life fade away. And now the news that he was alive. There was no way that could be true. He thought they hadn't seen anything. He was startled by the idea that he might be a ghost. Beginning to tremble, he thought that he had to find him. Night had already fallen, and in the third shelter, Kang Yin was leaning against a corner of the staircase. Chief Huang spoke to the young man, telling him he should be inside because everyone was still in shock. Placing a hand on the young man's shoulder, he asked if he had heard him. He shouldn't be out there until he had recovered. But when Kang realized he had been touched, he was startled, turned to the side, and fell down the steps. One asked him what was going on, but the young man was deeply lost in thought about what he had seen. It was definitely young Rim on the rooftop of the school. He was certain it was her. Turning his back on the man, he simply took off running. Wang just watched as he left. Not understanding what had just happened with the young man, he grumbled and went back inside. Meanwhile, the young man pedaled his bicycle quickly, convinced that something had happened at the school. The news had said the school had been taken over by someone. She was a prisoner there, but he didn't know why. He wanted to find the other students and teachers. Upon reaching the area, he abandoned his bicycle. Looking ahead at the remains of Ingan High, he could hear some noises. Checking what it was, he noticed someone standing guard near the wall, yawning out of boredom. Observing the surroundings, he couldn't believe the school had ended up like this. It looked like a hideout for thieves. He noticed there were guards at both entrances. He had no idea how he would get in. Feeling disheartened at the thought of not being able to save young Rim, he was suddenly pulled by his clothes. The person grabbing him pushed him against the wall and even shined a flashlight in his eyes to check his identity. Jang Taesik asked how he was still alive. He needed to confirm it for himself. Then he demanded to know why Kang was there and if he had lost his mind, releasing him afterward. Shining the flashlight at his face again, he realized that, for some reason, Kang was in good shape. Looking at him, Jang said he was sure that this time, he would end things for good. He kept insisting on knowing why Kang was there. The young man, pressed against the wall with the light in his face, couldn't think straight. He asked the red-haired young man if he had come there alone. That question surprised Jang, but the protagonist quickly took the flashlight from his hand. Turning it off, he asked if, besides that, he hadn't brought anything else with him. After saying that, Kang struck Jang, hitting him square in the nose. Furious, Jang said that he had hit first. That was a sign that he had finally gathered his courage. He also tried to strike back, but Kang dodged. Growing impatient, Jang attempted to land kicks, but they were blocked as well. He asked if Kang was insisting on dying, but somehow the protagonist managed to counterattack and knock the red-haired young man to the ground. He thought about how he no longer had the same body as before. His muscles had weakened, and his body was still fragile. That's when he realized he couldn't win with brute strength alone. He needed the right skills. The young man on the ground managed to land a kick on Kang's leg, followed by a heavy cross punch. Knocking him back, Jang spoke into his communicator, saying Kang was finished. He called for the guards nearby. He reported that he was at the end of the street, by the back gate, but as he spoke, he was struck again. His transmitter fell to the ground, and the protagonist stepped on it, keeping his foot firmly in place. Immediately after, Kang showed courage by striking Jang multiple times, catching him off guard. After being thrown to the ground, Jang continued to take hits until, at one point, he called out the protagonist's name. Grabbing the red-haired young man by the collar, Kane demanded to know what had happened at the school. Meanwhile, inside the school, someone was lighting a candle. Young Rim's roommate asked where she was going. She said she was going for a walk, but the woman told her not to. If she was seen, there could be trouble. But young Rim didn't see a problem since they weren't prisoners, so she took the candle and walked through the corridors. Hearing a noise, she looked out the window and saw several people gathered on the ground. She wondered if everyone was really okay with this, and if they were willing to remain in the school. Just because the world had changed, that couldn't be the case. She thought that, at the very least, she should know what was happening in the rest of the world. When a guard shone a flashlight near her, he asked where she was going. She asked if she was being spied on, but he told her that she was only being protected. He explained that the others agreed with this, and she asked about those who didn't agree. It was amusing to see that the world outside was dangerous, yet she had no way of knowing because they wouldn't let her leave. Feeling deeply sad, as if she wasn't even in her own body, she stated that she had seen terrible things, not just him, but the whole world had. She said they needed a system to survive, that rules were necessary. She was certain that power had gone to their heads. Even so, she was determined to leave. However, the young man grabbed her arm, calling her by name. Annoyed, she slapped him across the face and told him not to touch her. She asked who had given him authority over her. She added that, from what she had seen, all they wanted was to build a kingdom and rule over them. At that moment, she heard Zhang Xiaotian's voice over the radio, requesting reinforcements, saying he was at the end of the street, near the back gate. She asked if he was going to help. He replied that it wasn't his job to do that. His job was simply to guard that corridor and tell her to go back to sleep. Meanwhile, outside, the fight was unfolding. The two young men seemed evenly matched as they exchanged blows. But seeing an opportunity to finish him off, Zhang Xiaotian picked up a fallen brick from the ground and, swinging upward, struck the young man's head several times, saying he wanted him to stop living. Kang, blocking the blows with both hands wrapped around his head, thought that his body still felt indifferent. Even so, he lunged at the young man, grabbing him around the waist and throwing him to the ground again. He thought he could see the movements and knew how to counter, but his body did nothing. Summoning his willpower, he warned that if it was against Zhang Xiaotian, he would fight back, even with his broken body. And in a fit of rage, he managed to land another cross punch to his opponent's face. However, both of them collapsed to the ground, exhausted. Moments later, as the protagonist stood up, he told the young man to recover quickly, and asked what was happening, but when he looked to the side, the young man was still lying on the ground, and beside him, someone enormous appeared, asking who this guy was. When Kang looked up, he realized it was Min Do Wong, someone he recognized. He was startled, and asked if he was from the same school, as he was sure he had seen that face somewhere before. Inside the school, young Ren, after unsuccessfully trying to leave and failing, returned to the hallway, thinking that she couldn't just stand there, while she didn't know what had happened to the rest of the world. She believed that even if she had to persuade the others, she would find a way out. Then, someone grabbed her hand. Startled, she looked and saw that it was her teacher, calling her over along with other people. They pleaded with her not to do it. They said the world outside was terrifying and that it was safer inside the school. They said their friends were protecting them, but they all had the same look, empty bodies, devoid of life. Outside, Kang, after dealing with the red-haired young man, was now being brutally beaten by Min Do Wong, who had strength far beyond normal. For him, it was easy to hit a weakened opponent like Kang. The protagonist thought that he couldn't possibly fight against this guy, but he still charged at him every time. Despite being struck multiple times, he refused to give up and endured blow after blow. And no matter how hard he tried, he felt that he couldn't win, while the tall young man continued advancing toward him, saying that he was really good at getting beaten up, but Kang kept thinking about his friend inside the school. Even though his opponent was extremely strong, he still hadn't given up, and as he tried to stand up again, he heard a voice inside his head, asking what he was doing in a fight he couldn't possibly win. Min Do Wong suddenly remembered where he had seen him before, but as the protagonist prepared to get up, he seemed to notice the presence of someone else, and thought to himself that this was the end. Looking up, he realized that Min Do Wong had also heard the sound. Seeing his opponent distracted, Kang seized the chance to run. When Min Do Wong noticed, he shouted for him to come back, but it was too late. Kang had already gained some distance. As he ran, he kept thinking about what was happening, convinced that he had truly lost his mind. Trying to push the thought aside for a second, he grabbed a bicycle from the marketplace to make his escape. Pedaling as fast as he could, he knew he couldn't do anything about the situation for now, but he would return once he was ready. But as he pedaled, something happened, and when he looked back, he couldn't avoid what was in front of him. He ended up falling off the bicycle. Still on the ground, trying to get up, he was sweating and coughing heavily. Looking ahead, something in the distance seemed too unbelievable. Even though he was staring at it, he couldn't comprehend what it was. It looked like a futuristic being, floating and seemingly armed. He also couldn't see its face, as it wore some kind of helmet. The being also appeared to have a tail, something beyond anything the protagonist could have imagined. As hard as it was to believe, something surreal stood right in front of him, and that being asked if he was receiving the communication feed. Not knowing what that meant, he asked what it was. He was told that it was Observation Unit 19. These occurrences had taken place despite it being considered an inappropriate complex organism. Kang Yin, terrified, tried to say he had no idea what the being was talking about. However, the observation procedure was being terminated, and a bright light shot toward him, knocking him to the ground while the floating entity emitted light. Had Ingun high, while standing guard outside, he despised the boys who were inside. It practically had a banquet, enough food to feed many people. The leader told Jian Mun-chan that things like this happened, and he just needed to pay more attention next time. Their table talk was filled with curses and insults, with Inchi mocking Jian Mun. The boss defended him, saying he had done well up to that point and that they should stop bothering him over one mistake. He then ordered the guy from the lab to fetch another box of kimchi and more water. The red-haired guy told him to hurry up, and warned him not to even think about stealing anything from the storage. The leader noticed his face was bruised. That's when he said he had fought 3 people at once, but it was nothing worth mentioning. He added that if he looked bad, he couldn't imagine how the others had ended up. Inchi Young also started provoking him. The poor guy who had just delivered the water couldn't hold back a slight smile, and was immediately scolded. Min Do Wong wanted to know how things were outside, as many teachers and students were happy. Others were curious about the situation, thinking that maybe it wasn't so dangerous outside since they had seen the helicopter. Even though their boss was difficult to deal with, he seemed sad when recalling what had happened when the world collapsed. He said they were key players in all of this, protecting and controlling that place. Jang Tae-sik, seeing that there was nothing more to discuss, announced that he was leaving and stepped outside. Right in front of him stood the lab guy, the one who wore glasses. The young man asked if he needed anything. Showing his dominance, Jang grabbed him by the hair and pressed a fork against his cheek to assert control. He asked if the boy thought he was some kind of clown there to entertain others. But then, their leader, Seong Chun, appeared outside and asked what he was doing. He scolded the red-haired young man, reminding him that they had few workers, and told the lab assistant to stay alert. After Seong Chun left, the red-haired young man showed no respect. Irritated, he struck the assistant, making sure he stayed in line. He made it clear that an executive of this operation could not be treated as a joke. Once again, he kicked the young man and asked if Jang Tae-sik seemed funny now. A short time later, the young assistant was on his knees before the red-haired man, pleading for forgiveness. Meanwhile, the situation at the third shelter was different. Things seemed calm and organized. People remained communicative despite everything. They seemed hopeful and supportive of one another. They told Chief Huang that they had always taken good care of the person who had been outside protecting them. And as soon as he took his post, the dog approached him, seemingly trying to get his attention. As if wanting Huang to follow him, the man found that morning to be very unusual. When he arrived at the spot where the dog had stopped, he thought something must be wrong and looked around. Then, when he looked into a corner, he noticed the young man, and the dog stared at him as if asking for help. Huang Chan carried him to what appeared to be an infirmary, and when he woke up, the protagonist fell to the floor. The man commented that even while waking up, he managed to cause a mess. It was a habit of his to look like a lifeless body. The young man already understood what was happening and was certain he had found something while escaping. Bringing his hands to his face, he wondered if everything had been just a dream. Trembling, he apologized and explained that he had tripped. Wang Chang said that since he was already awake, he might as well get up, as long as he watched over the warehouse at night. He used that place to sleep during the day and avoid other people, making it clear that the mat was his. After saying that, he turned away. Kang was trying to remove the IV from his arm when the man told him he was good at getting beaten up. At the very least, he could do some exercises since he had already come up with the excuse of falling down the stairs. He figured the boy's real skill was escaping death, considering it seemed like he had been through several wars. Outside, Kang Yin noticed the shelter's receptionist, who asked if he was okay. She asked what he had done the night before since he was all bruised and assumed he had a strange habit. She explained that since there were no available seats on the transport bus, she had listed him as an injured person. But he was, by far, the most injured person there. That was only to help him find a safe place with his family. He thought it was a miracle that he had even woken up from the coma in the first place. But what could he do with such a weak body? It would be better to find people who could help the school in the general shelter, but even attempting that was insane. He asked the chief if he planned to take the transport bus. The chief replied that he wasn't injured. He had already agreed to stay there until everyone was taken out of the danger zone. With a sad and empty look, like the others, he said that given the state of the world, it was better to stay there, especially since he had no family. Hearing that, Kang felt embarrassed by his own comment. Even when he lay down, he couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about young Rin, trapped in the school with dangerous people. He knew the school gang had likely taken control, and their leader was Tang Sung-chun. When morning came, he started running, feeling like he was losing his mind. There was a rage inside him, making his blood boil with every step. Even after running for a long time, it didn't subside. Sitting down to eat, he kept thinking about how much he wanted revenge. He was deeply troubled. There were so many emotions swirling inside him that he couldn't even name them. He exercised to the point of losing control. He tried to suppress the impulse within him. He thought there was nothing he could do for now. Wang Chang occasionally passed by and observed the young man, who was once again punching a tree. When it was time to leave, a crowd was waiting outside to be transported. The shelter representative spoke through a megaphone, announcing that the bus would arrive soon and asking the group leaders to gather. Kang Yin rushed over to the chief of security, who was surprised that he hadn't left yet. The young man wanted to thank him for all the care he had shown and for looking after the dog as well. He knelt down and spoke to the dog, telling him that he couldn't go now, but he would return soon, and asked him to stay safe. As soon as he arrived, a line was formed. The military was also there. He thought about finding another option. Meanwhile, the guard was on watch, and the dog stayed by his side, clearly saddened by the absence of his friend. Sometimes the dog whimpered. The guard told him that he wasn't his owner and that he shouldn't cause trouble, just stay calm. The dog, disheartened, could only lament the fact that he had lost the elderly couple, his canine brother, and now his friend. Then he suddenly heard a familiar sound, which put Chief Wang on high alert when he saw the young man standing in front of him. He asked what he was doing there since the bus had left some time ago. Kang told the security chief that he had trained in sports. Among them, taekwondo, kendo, and boxing. However, he had only been a decent fighter when he was younger before the coma. He regretted that his body had become weak and sluggish, despite his hard training to return to his former shape. Wang paused, looked at him, and asked what his point was. Kang explained that he wanted him to teach him how to fight. The story shifts back a few months, to a random afternoon around 5:45 p.m. Someone commented that it looked like it would rain, but instead it was just cloudy. The world seemed peaceful. People were enjoying themselves, walking their dogs, and chatting with friends. Everything felt normal. A young man delivering a package still had the parcel in his hands. In the background, a fight broke out at a small bar. Life was simply moving forward. Those people were just fighting. The city was intact, and the sky was still blue. Teachers were respected and could work in peace. At the end of the day, someone was locking up the laboratory. They walked calmly down the hallway until something caught their eye. A small spider web in the corner. The dirt was irritating. Even so, they looked around, and he noticed a mess in the classroom. They were at the computers, looking at memories from past years. The student young Ren was helping the teacher, as she had just gone out to get food for him. That teacher was worried because her grades had dropped significantly ever since her friend had gotten hurt, but she said she still had hope that he would wake up soon. He told her that if anything was bothering her, she could talk to him. With a smile, he told her she could consider him a father, and if she had any questions, she could ask him. After some time, the teacher who had gone outside to get food for them returned. He was satisfied because he had brought pizza for everyone, and laughing, he told the other teacher he should eat a slice. Then he remembered that he hadn't brought anything to drink and said he would go back out to buy something. Professor Park found it strange that someone so forgetful was a teacher like him. But Professor Yoon was energetic and well known by everyone. He rushed down the stairs to the convenience store. On the way, he ran into the janitor going up the stairs. His shift had already ended, yet he was still around. The janitor wanted to know who else was in the building. The teacher informed him that all the teachers and some students were there. Watching the teacher descend the stairs with such energy, the janitor thought to himself that it must be nice to be young. He walked calmly through the hallways, glancing out the windows at the female teachers helping some students. He thought that Cora was practicing and that they were good people. He observed everything, going from room to room. He went up and down the stairs, checking to make sure everything was properly locked. However, he encountered some troublemakers. He asked them what they were doing there since they should have been home by now. The boys ignored him, mocking him. They said he was just an angry old guard. The janitor told them they weren't allowed to be there. The red-haired student assured the janitor that they were just talking and would be leaving soon. The students looked defiant, as if they were trying to challenge the janitor. One of them seemed particularly influential. He told the janitor that he should go tell his father that he had interrupted his conversation with his friends. Annoyed, the old man told them to hurry up and not to smoke since the building would be closing soon. Jang Taestek, pleased, praised the young man for being the son of a politician and having a lot of influence. However, they weren't there alone. There was also a thin boy with glasses and another stronger one. They were constantly bullied by those students, forced to do physical exercises to the point of exhaustion. The politician's son asked the leader of the gang, Yang Tong-chun, what he was doing to keep them in line. Suddenly, he stopped speaking and decided to teach the weaker boys a lesson for not paying attention to him. He yelled at the leader, saying it was his fault for letting them rebel and failing to keep them properly under control. However, the leader remained silent, not saying a word or showing any sign of reaction. Meanwhile, the red-haired young man tried to calm Sun Hum down, telling him it was his mistake and apologizing. Then he asked the boy with glasses if he had gone to the hospital to check on Kang Yeon's condition. Mocking him, he asked if he was sad that the other boy had been left in a vegetative state. The boy with glasses, trembling and crying, said that Yeon hadn't regained consciousness and that he didn't think he would wake up. Those words sent Jang Tae-sik into a furious state. He forced the boy to repeat that the student had fallen from the ledge on his own. Meanwhile, Professor Park, bothered by a spiderweb, grabbed a ladder and asked Young-rin if she could remove it. She was told that she could go inside and eat pizza in peace, but first she wanted to change clothes, since she was wearing a skirt. But the teacher said there was no need and that she was wasting time. The teacher reminded her of what he had said earlier, that she should see him as a father. He quickly climbed the ladder and removed the web. Placing a hand on her arm, he told her everything was fine and that she could trust him. But when Professor Yoon arrived and saw the scene, he became furious at Professor Park. Shocked, Park asked the girl to tell the professor that he hadn't done anything inappropriate to either of them. Professor Yoon, usually a calm man, lost his temper. He removed Park's hand from the girl and warned him that if he touched her again, he wouldn't hesitate to break his hand. However, Professor Park claimed he was innocent and that Yoon had misunderstood. And suddenly, everything started shaking. They felt the first tremors of an earthquake beginning. The boys in the basement, who were gathered in a group, also felt the shaking and realized it was an earthquake. People in the park felt the intense tremors and knew something was wrong, but the situation only worsened. The people fighting in the bar and the police trying to break it up also felt the strong tremors. Suddenly, the tremors intensified, turning into high-magnitude earthquakes. Everyone watched as the city began to collapse, and by 6-8 p.m., people were already terrified of what might happen. Various unidentified systems, seemingly not from that time, appeared highly futuristic. They hovered over large parts of the country, and the earthquakes continued, leaving people in absolute terror. Those flying artifacts, which closely resembled alien ships, began bombarding everything. Nothing seemed destined to remain intact. Everyone who witnessed it was struck with overwhelming fear. The students at Ingben School felt like the world was falling apart, and the students in the basement even spotted a strange object. The leader of the place and one of his subordinates were descending a staircase, and as they did, he asked Professor Cho Kyun how the night shift had been and if he was tired. The professor replied that he was only doing what was instructed. Satisfied, the two continued down the stairs, telling him to keep up the good work. The professor, his head down, thought about how this was the gang that controlled the school. He believed that if it weren't for that incident, no one would have dared to challenge their group. He recalled that it had just been another ordinary day and that he had been training to prevent an outburst of rage. In the locker room, he remembered his student as he looked at his uniform, and at the back of the locker, a photo of the three of them. He thought that if Kang Yeon truly wanted to recover, he shouldn't waste any more time and should visit him soon. As he was leaving through the back door, a group of troublemakers called out his name. When he turned around, they asked if he was going home and made a few jokes that he found pathetic. He couldn't believe his student had lost to those people. There was a good chance they were responsible. That was what he was thinking when everything suddenly began to shake. He felt violent tremors, as if the sky itself was collapsing. Then he noticed something unusual being launched toward the school, but he couldn't explain what it was. His eyes went blank the moment he caught sight of the unidentified object. Looking to the side, he saw that the janitor was also struggling to stay steady due to the tremors. The professor ran over to the older man and asked if he was okay. The janitor was still disoriented. He told him they needed to leave, but the janitor refused, insisting that there were still students inside the building. The professor said nothing. He simply left the man there and ran off to find the students. At the troublemakers' gathering spot, a strange object appeared, and from it emerged something unfamiliar. It looked like a robot, but it was eerily intelligent and sinister. The sight of it left everyone in shock. They immediately decided to run. Those strange beings made noises as if trying to communicate with them. Meanwhile, the professor rushed toward the students, trying to protect them. He urged them to leave immediately, because it was too dangerous to stay. At the same time, Professor Yoon instructed his student, Young Ren, to hide under a table. Professor Park commented that these couldn't just be earthquakes. Earthquakes didn't shake and vibrate the ground like this. The three of them were determined to get out of there and started running, searching for an exit. The frightened professor reached the others and asked if they were okay. He was especially worried about Professor Kang. Meanwhile, the delinquent students, all armed with whatever they could find, rushed out in a panic. However, they soon realized they couldn't leave through the front doors because the ceiling had collapsed. That was when they had the idea to try the back entrance. They asked what they would do if the back door was also blocked. As the delinquent students, teachers, and other students met, they were informed about the front doors being inaccessible. Then the professor mentioned that the back door was clear since he had just passed through it to leave. Determined to get out at any cost, the students suddenly found themselves face to face with something monstrous. Yang Sung-chun's eyes widened when he saw the creature. However, he couldn't afford to show fear, nor could he appear weak in front of the others. Professor Yoon urged them to move forward but hadn't yet seen the enigmatic creature standing in front of them. When everyone finally laid eyes on it, they froze in terror. The red-haired troublemaker ordered the creature to get out of their way. Even though they were all visibly afraid, they resolved to confront it and continued demanding that it step aside. The being in front of them made a threatening gesture with its hand as if preparing to strike. And after that dramatic movement, what looked like a man from the future transformed his fists. And with that weapon, he began firing at everyone. It was like a sonic weapon. Many of them were thrown back, while others were left disoriented by the creature standing before them. It decided to open its helmet, revealing its face. It was a demonic figure with enormous teeth and glowing red eyes. It told them that the native organisms were weak, and they noticed that the monster was speaking, yet its lips did not move. It stated that they were risk factors and had already been assessed, and until their removal, they would follow its instructions. The monster also mentioned that despite their weakness, it acknowledged that they possessed a certain level of intelligence. As the monster threatened everyone there, Yang Sung-chun did not hesitate to protect what was his. Armed with a shovel, he drove it into the neck of the strange being, as it was the only vulnerable spot. He had realized this after seeing the creature remove its helmet to instill fear in people. As a leader, he shouted for all his subordinates to attack the monster at once. The order was clear, no mercy, as the monster was only talking to stall and hurt them. Even so, the monster managed to fire a laser into Yang Sung-chun's stomach, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to defeat him, much less to break his determination to destroy the monster. With uncontrollable rage, the student continued to strike the creature, which had already fallen. The other students and teachers could only stand together and watch in fear, too terrified to act. While normal people, such as the teachers and some students, were left shaken. That group of troublemaking students, from that moment on, became the ones in control of the place. At the shelter, the protagonist wanted Chief Huang Chang to teach him how to fight. However, he wondered if this was just so he could go back to school and pick a fight with the guys who had stolen from them. Huang responded that yes, he was going to the school, but not for no reason. The man said the reason was revenge, but he also didn't care about anything he said and had no intention of teaching him. He made it clear that he hated doing inconvenient things, especially getting involved with other people, and now he was being asked to do both. He concluded that the young man wouldn't give up, no matter how many times he refused, and he didn't want to be bothered. For that reason, after thinking it over, he decided to give him 10 minutes of his time, but only if he could knock him down. He warned that he wouldn't go too hard on him, but if he failed, after 10 minutes, he should get on the next bus and leave. Kang thought about his words, clenching his fists and getting into a fighting stance. He said he would give it his best shot. With only 10 minutes, he immediately started trying to mimic the moves in front of him without overanalyzing them. The man who was supposed to train him simply dodged, noticing how slow he was, and then countered with a kick. As the young man bent over in pain from the blow to his abdomen, the man followed up with a kick to his face. Looking down at the young man on the ground, Wang Chang told him he was slow, like a slug. He asked why he was so concerned about the state of the world, as if he were the only one with problems. He had heard that Kang was searching for his family, so he should go peacefully and see for himself. At that moment, as he closed his eyes, it was as if the story of his life was unfolding before him. His mother and uncle had arrived desperately at the place where he was hospitalized in a coma, but they were stopped at the entrance. The police refused to let them in, even as his mother pleaded that her son was inside. Desperate, she demanded to know what had happened to Yan and insisted on seeing him. The protagonist's uncle, calling his sister-in-law by name, listened as the guards stated that it was a crisis, that they were authorized to use force for their own safety, and he fell silent for a moment. Then he suddenly ran forward, telling his sister-in-law to wait. He would find his nephew first. Even as firefighters and police officers tried to stop him from entering the building, he didn't hesitate and kept running. The building was unstable, and tremors shook it constantly, but despite the warnings, he kept going. He ran as fast as he could, but unfortunately, a piece of the ceiling collapsed on his head, knocking him unconscious instantly. When they managed to retrieve him, he had a head injury but still struggled to move forward to find his nephew. More unknown artillery was being fired at various buildings, and Ingen High had been hit. The two boys who had been bullied and used as errand boys were hiding, and when they saw an object crash nearby, they ran away as fast as they could, terrified. The taller boy with blonde hair called out for Homyoung to wait for him, and the two of them rushed up the stairs. Suddenly, the smaller boy with glasses stopped behind the blonde-haired one and asked why he had stopped. Then he was standing in front of that group of rowdy students and the decapitated monster on the ground. Also on the ground, next to the monster, was Yang Tongchun, who had been wounded in the abdomen. Currently, he walked through the corridor with his shirt open, revealing a large scar. As he passed through that corridor, he asked Homyoung, calling him a laborer, if he had seen Zhang Taesik, and he said that when he did, he should order him to see him immediately in the office. He paused for a moment and looking back saw their leader leaving and decided to stop for a moment. However, he was noticed by the leader, who ordered him to stop standing around and get to work. Meanwhile, in Shelter No. 3, the dog Soja watched sadly as his friend Kang Yeon was beaten without being able to fight back. It made no sense as he was trying to resist Huang Chang and kept getting struck down, returning to the ground. The man then said it was clear he practiced combat sports because of his posture, which was quite decent. His movements were organized, but he wanted to know why he was still so determined to enter the school. Kang Yan, after falling, got up again, determined, saying that the 10 minutes weren't up yet. He kept trying to land a hit, but the man always dodged. This time he was grabbed by the neck, and after that he received an uppercut, falling to the ground once more. Wang said he didn't understand why he kept going. He couldn't possibly want to learn the techniques that badly. He asked if the boy wanted him to teach him how to fight to win, but he was treating it like a game. Kang got up again and charged at Boss Wang, but Wang simply commented that the boy was too weak. He exposed his body, which had many blind spots. Saying this, he landed another kick to his abdomen. Holding him in a headlock, he pointed out that he wasn't strong enough and wasn't fast either. He said there was no need to get too close to strike and asked what he would do if the opposite were true. Once again, the boy hit the ground. The man said he should combine his size with the rules of sports. However, in real fights, it was very different. Opponents would be faster, stronger, and use tricks. Most of the time, dirty moves and deceitful tactics. How did he expect to win by continuing like this? Still on the ground, Kang Yan said that was exactly why he needed him to be his master. Determined to end the lesson, the man said there was no reason to teach a brat who treated fighting like a sport. Turning his back on him, he said he hoped he would stop being a nuisance from then on. Once more, the protagonist got up from the ground, shouting that it wasn't over, and tried to hit him. Before he could land a strike, Wang Chang told him he shouldn't go around shouting before attacking someone from behind. Teaching the boy some manners, who was now on the ground again, he said it was easy to read his movements. He told him that his movements should be as if he truly intended to finish someone. The dog Soja's ears drooped. Looking down and already out of patience, Wang Chang told Kang that he had failed. Lying on the ground, Kang himself wondered how he could say that, how he expected him to fight. That was why he wanted to learn from him. But then he remembered the dirty way he fought against the red-haired guy. That time, he hadn't been beaten as badly. Gritting his teeth, determined to earn his attention and be trained, he said he wasn't done yet. The man slightly turned and said he knew this was going to happen. However, he couldn't finish his sentence. He was interrupted by a headbutt that stunned him and brought him to his knees. After that, the boy grabbed a jar. Using a plant that was nearby, he did as Wang had explained before. Even though his eyes were filled with pity, he knew that if he wanted to be trained and re-enter the school to find his friend, he had to do what Wang wanted. That was when he let rage consume his heart and did what had to be done. After that, he stood still, looking at the man on the ground. Wang was in disbelief at what he had just witnessed. He told the boy that he had passed. This excited the dog Soja, who had been watching, making his ears perk up. In the past, Kang Yan thought he needed to study and was beginning to think more objectively, because when he was an athlete with decent skill, he had never been the best. He tried many different things, but was always just a decent participant. He wasn't sure whether he should continue or not. Inside the bus, he thought that things could be different. He would soon become an adult. Then a message arrived on his phone. Young Rin was worried and wanted to quit the training. Later, when he was already in school, he heard one or two insults from Zhang Taesik. He heard people saying that the new kid had tried to fight the senior, but he didn't pay attention to that matter. In the bathroom, he found the whole situation regrettable, and when he heard a noise, he went to check. It was Hum Yang sitting on the floor and dirty. That was how he always ended up when the games were over. Kang looked at the boy and asked if he was okay. He just ran away. At that moment, the protagonist thought he had no right to interfere and just wanted to ignore it. A new teacher had arrived, Yoon Ji-hoo, assigned as a guide but also teaching English. He asked everyone to get along and to strive to be kind to each other. Kang, looking around, noticed who his classmates would be. Zhang Taesik and also the boy he always bullied. Even so, he thought he should just get along with the rest of the class and ignore that situation. He believed that was all he had to do. Every time he passed through the hallways, there were Zhang Taesik and the other two, and he always walked past without paying attention to what was happening to the boys who were being targeted. When class ended, he did what he always did, went to his notebook to write down the lesson. And even after class ended, seeing that those two still hadn't done anything, the red-haired boy was still there. In truth, he thought they were all pathetic, including the ones being bullied for not fighting back. Good morning. When he returned home, his uncle was there and had brought some pastries for them to eat together. His uncle talked about the renovation at the gym and said he wouldn't be able to go there for a few days. The boy said he was thinking of taking a break anyway since it was exam season. The conversation was pleasant, and his uncle said the boy reminded him of his father. It all started when he wanted to know if his uncle used to work out when he was younger. He soon realized that the boy actually wanted to know what he was like back then. Kang was more specific and asked if he used to pick on weaker people. His uncle clearly disapproved of that kind of behavior. He said he worked out to get stronger, not to beat up the weak. When his aunt wanted to know what her husband was like in the past, his uncle replied that he was calm and studious. Then his uncle explained that real men didn't show off their strength or hit weaker people. He asked if there were people like that at his school. The boy said there were many like that. He said that the bullies were annoying, but the beaten-up boys also seemed pathetic. His uncle wanted to know if they had been in the same class since the first year and what their names were. His nephew thought for a moment, then remembered their names. The skinny one with glasses was Kim Hyumyang, and the other one was Jo Go-hyun. His uncle continued asking if he had seen his classmates every day for almost 2 years. When he learned that his nephew had done nothing, he said he was no longer welcome at the gym. Not only that, but he also wanted him to stop working out. He hated the fact that his own nephew was like that. Maybe he didn't hit the weak, but he also didn't defend them and just stood by. Kang, not knowing what to say, remained silent, as his uncle's words made him reflect. The next day, on his way to school on the bus, he thought about what his uncle had said. He heard the next stop being announced and noticed an elderly woman getting on. He promptly offered her his seat. But Hyumyang, who was closer to her, offered his seat instead. She thanked him and said he was a good boy. Kang noticed that despite everything, he was cheerful, unlike how he was at school. He seemed sad and worried. Even so, on the way, he saw some ants and got all excited watching them. He also got thrilled when he saw a car of the model he liked. Kang didn't understand. Even though he was a victim, he seemed quite happy with his life. But he wasn't surprised that he changed the moment he stepped into school. He thought it must be hell. While he was distracted, young Ren took advantage of his lowered guard and landed a punch on his stomach. Then, as if nothing had happened, she asked if she had all the materials she needed. While they were talking, the teacher appeared in the background, always observing their behavior. Hyumyang hurried to take the lunch he had bought to Jang Tae-sik so that he wouldn't get beaten that day. Kang heard when the boy handed over the lunch and was harshly scolded for being a little late. At the end of the day, as always, they kept bothering the boy. They always wanted more money. That day he couldn't just walk past as he always did. His conscience was weighed down by his uncle's words. He still remembered him saying that it was to protect those he loved, his friends, his family, and others. So this time, he decided to step in and ask them to stop and leave Hyumyang alone. Even just saying that, it felt good to break the silence that had weighed on his heart. He had managed to get their attention. Jang Tae-sik, making fun of him, asked if the model student had decided to rebel, and he tried to hit him with an egg, saying that he would be his new slave. The protagonist easily dodged and let the troublemaker fall to the ground on his own. Kang looked at the boy and asked if he knew who he was. He said yes, that they had been in the same class for 2 years. He said that was correct, and that should be enough. After that, he sighed deeply. He explained that Hyumyang wanted to protect him, but the red-haired boy, upon falling to the ground, had hurt his face. He got up with a wooden stick, enraged, looking to strike the one who had injured his face. However, the protagonist dodged all his attacks and even countered some. Tae-sik ended up taking a few hits, yet still came back to fight again. He told Kang he didn't know he was cosplaying as a nerd and asked if he had tried that somewhere else. He kept trying to attack, even though his strikes were useless, as they were all dodged or blocked. As a last resort, he retaliated, trying to discourage Jang Tae-sik from challenging him. However, the red-haired boy kept insulting him with curses and taunts, also saying that none of it hurt. That made the protagonist lose his patience. But when he was about to punch him in the face, he changed his mind. He only lightly hit his shoulder and then gave gentle slaps to the red-haired boy's face. He remarked how lucky he was, because if he had hit his face, he would have been knocked out. He explained that he had done that on purpose, only out of consideration for him. With a serious tone, he asked him not to fight with others. He also told him that he wouldn't even be able to lay a finger on him. He asked Hyumyang to get up because they were going back together. After that, he looked back and told Jang Tae-sik that he would forget what happened that day, and that he could continue being the class leader, but he shouldn't bother other people. That way, he wouldn't need to pay attention to him again. Jang Tae-sik, hearing all this, didn't seem to agree. Kang said that he had noticed Hyumyang took the same bus, so they should go to school together. The desire for revenge was clear in Jang Tae-sik's eyes. Sooner or later, things were going to get worse. However, Kang Yan thought that was enough. He believed it would all end there. He walked happily with his friend Young Rin, who was upset, saying that he had a rock in place of a brain. His friend encouraged her to stay because she was the reason he was there. As they were talking, his name was called. Young Rin asked if they were his friends. He said no and asked the red-haired boy how he knew that the cram school he attended was there, and they went somewhere else to settle the issue between them. This time, the red-haired boy wasn't alone. He had 3 friends, and the 4 of them called themselves the 4 Celestial Kings. One of them, wearing a mask, commented that he had heard that Kang had fought with the Celestial King Knife Fist. That same masked guy spoke to a chubby boy with glasses, calling him Quick Shot, and told him to keep an eye on the girl. Now he was satisfied. He also had a cool nickname. They should call him Quick Shot. And he started talking to Young Rin, saying that she shouldn't like someone like Kang. She looked at the boy and said he should go help his friends instead. When Quick Shot turned to look, one of them was already on the ground. The red-haired boy, angry, said that they couldn't let their guard down against him for a second. It would be better if they all attacked together. Kang, turning his blazer into a makeshift glove, warned that he wouldn't let him get away like last time. Zhang Xiaotian was furious and wanted his revenge. He urged everyone to rush at Kang, but Kang was obviously faster than them and managed to land several hits without taking a single one. Zhang Xiaotian was the last one standing, but even he didn't escape the consequences. When the protagonist raised his leg to deliver a kick, his friend shouted, stopping him from doing it. She began scolding him, asking if he was crazy, if he was really going to kick them. Quick Shot, trying to act like the leader, ordered the others to get up and stop crying because he already had a hostage. Young Rin, who had just scolded Kang, saying that he couldn't kick them, lost her patience. She ended up kicking Quick Shot directly after he touched her shoulder, and the boy, full of regret, collapsed on the ground. And finally, they were all defeated, and the 2 of them left. Kang still questioned why only she was allowed to kick. She wanted to know what kind of things he had been doing at school to get into conflicts like that. After that incident, there were a few more like it, but they were the protagonist's fault. Even though he didn't want any problems that could spiral out of control, he believed he should have let the guy land a few hits and then give up. As he was thinking this, someone placed a hand on his shoulder and said they needed to talk. Then Kang Moon-chan appeared, but he didn't know who he was either. However, he told Kang they needed to talk and asked him to come with them and stay quiet. When they reached the rooftop, he realized what it was about. It was the red-haired guy again. This time, there were more people with him besides the 2 who had been following Kang. And from that day on, a hellish year would begin, but memories from another time were interrupted. When Wang, talking to him, started splashing some water on him, he said Kang hadn't even trained hard enough to be tired and told him to get up. Kang was pushing a car tire back and forth while the boss was counting. He had to lift the tire multiple times to block any blows aimed at his face. Meanwhile, Wang held a bat, trying to strike to make the training more effective. Afterward, Kang had to keep the tire low to protect himself. In the end, he was using it as a shield. At Ingan School, Moon-chan was lost in thought until he remembered something and shared it with the leader. He asked if he remembered when he talked about the guy who tried to stop them when they raided the shelter. He explained that the guy was the one Zhang Xiaotian had asked them to take care of. His face had changed, but it was him. The leader wanted to know why he had only shown up now after everything that had happened between them. He found it strange that Kang Yan had woken up after being in a coma for over 6 months. The long-haired guy asked if the boss remembered when he had asked them to stay quiet at the cafe. Yang Sung-chun remembered that time fondly because he really wished they had done that. He recalled, while sitting in a cafe with friends, that after high school, they wouldn't be able to do the same things they had done in middle school. Maybe they would have to behave a little and actually study. The long-haired friend agreed, saying that acting like delinquents at school was starting to get boring. Yang Sung-chun even managed it for a while. He was starting to get used to being a normal student. Yang Tong-chun almost got what he wanted. His plan was to stay home and study. However, he started being chased, and he decided he wouldn't play nice. He gathered his crew and decided to take over the school. He set up a meeting with the seniors who had bullied him before. It was already nighttime. They arrived on motorcycles, making jokes and inappropriate comments. There were 3 of them, and as seniors, they thought they were kings of the place. The platinum-haired boss knew that messing with the seniors wasn't worth it, but he still wanted to confirm. So he asked one last time if they would leave them alone. The seniors thought they could teach him a lesson. Even while being insulted, the boss kept his head down, saying he was just thinking. But all of a sudden, he decided to act. He was very good at fighting. It wasn't for nothing that he had ruled middle school. He didn't feel the slightest bit sorry for the seniors who had bullied him when all he wanted was to be a normal student. After putting them in their place, he said that he was one of the top seniors, and even so, he hadn't been able to stay silent. The other 2, when they saw their senior on the ground, knew they had to do something. They couldn't just let it go. The one who settled it was the second in command, the long-haired guy, who decided to teach them a lesson with a well-placed kick. The platinum-haired boss told them they had only 1 hour to pick up the phone and make the call. Yang Tong-chun, the platinum-haired boss, after that day, cleaned out the school and took over in just 1 month. After that month, he got rid of everyone who had spread rumors about the school, and the platinum-haired boss's crew became a light. Kyung Mun Chan, the long-haired guy, had been a judo athlete when he was younger and always won. There was also the mad dog Lim Chin Young, known for his recklessness since elementary school. And lastly, the platinum-haired boss's childhood friend, Min Da Won. Before anything else, his physique was his greatest strength. Gang Taesik was the red-haired guy and thought the platinum-haired boss had charisma. And so we come to the incident that led the protagonist into a vegetative coma. When he was taken to the rooftop, the intention was for him to receive a lesson he would never forget. The red-haired boy confronted the protagonist, saying that he had claimed he would graduate. Without anyone even laying a finger on him, not even boss Yang Sung-chun, Kang Yan tried to explain himself to the boss, saying that he had some problems with the red-haired guy. While he spoke, the long-haired guy and the platinum-haired boss remained silent, just staring. This created some uncertainty for a moment between the red-haired boy and the long-haired guy's group. Kyung Mun Chan informed the red-haired boy that he and the other one would fight Kang at the same time. Jang Taesik didn't like the idea, and the protagonist even less. The long-haired boy asked what the boss thought. The boss agreed, so they should start fighting before the count reached 3. Going back to the time after the invasion of unknown beings, Soja had his favorite toy. Now the head of security, Wang Chong, had already become friends with Soja and was handing him tennis balls to carry. The young man, excited, said there were many things in the warehouse. It was a gym where they held events. The head of security got angry after seeing him with all that junk, saying that he should be training, because he was only supposed to fetch the tennis balls. Then he said he would demonstrate and called Rovachevsky to show how it was done. As soon as the ball was thrown, the dog ran as fast as he could to catch it, and that was all the protagonist had to do. However, he said he wouldn't do it under any circumstances. Wang said that if he didn't like it, he could just give up. He said he would do it but thought it was pointless. Then the head of security grabbed a baseball bat and threw the tennis ball as high as he could. He then informed him that the ball had likely landed on the other side of the street in an elementary school. It should be in the playground. He told him he had 3 minutes to retrieve it. Upon hearing that, the protagonist dashed off, so fast that he wasn't thinking about anything else, just retrieving the ball. He was already exhausted and still not getting close. He searched for the ball and found it near a tree. Satisfied, he picked it up and ran back. The boss was already irritated because he had taken 20 minutes to do it. He tried to explain, saying the playground was big. However, the boss threw another ball and told him to fetch it in 3 minutes. He ran off again, and he returned as fast as he could. This time, he looked even more exhausted than before. The boss threw another ball. Kang Yin went after it again, and this continued until sunset, with the head of security throwing the ball farther each time. He was already extremely tired and said he didn't think this was right, not that he was doubting it. However, he didn't know if just running would be beneficial, so he decided to increase the difficulty. After the young man put on weights, the boss looked at them and said they were kind of ugly but only about 15 kilograms. It was a weight for his legs, arms, and chest, and he had to run to fetch the ball with an extra 15 kilograms. As he ran, the boss shouted that physical strength was the foundation of everything. He said that Kang would get there once he got the hang of it. He had already been doing this for a week and hadn't improved at all. Wang Chong was disappointed because Kang had claimed before that he was an athlete. Lying on the ground, he argued that his body was completely worn out and he wasn't in the best condition. Then memories of the fight on the rooftop resurfaced. The red-haired boy had lunged at him. He managed to dodge skillfully. Even fighting 2 at once, he avoided any serious injuries. The long-haired guy pointed out that Jang Taesik was right. The protagonist was just toying with them. The rabid dog wanted to try too and asked the boss for permission, which he granted. So now the protagonist would fight 3 at once, and he knew the third was already on his way. His strikes were more precise and focused, so much so that Kang had to properly defend instead of just pushing back. The rabid dog admitted that he wouldn't be much of a challenge. Still, he thought it would be fun. Then he asked them not to tell anyone at school because he was embarrassed. Kang made the guy even angrier when he asked if he could stand by his words, and laughing nervously, he said he would. Kang, in a fighting stance, asked if he was sure. Both of them needed to win and prove they were better. However, the big guy was not succeeding. Every strike he threw was blocked. The protagonist simply dodged, saying there was a problem and that they should fight for real. His opponent was losing patience, trying at all costs to land a hit, but failing every time. At one moment he almost got hit. It was a very close call. Kang didn't seem to know when to stop, so he kept provoking the group. He wanted the guy to repeat the words he had said before and stick to them. However, he said it would be better if he wrote them down, so he could treat him properly. The opponent told him to watch carefully, very carefully. Kang started staring at him. Then he threw a punch at the face of the mad dog, who, annoyed, told the guy to control his strength. He said this had to be settled because things couldn't stay like that. Upset, he couldn't believe what was happening. However, the protagonist continued to strike his face as if it were a punching bag for practice. It was no wonder he had that nickname. No matter how much he got hit, he only seemed to get crazier. Kang kept escalating the fight, blow after blow, until he went too far and drove the mad dog into a rage. The mad dog lunged at him, trying to grab him by the legs. The move he pulled off was unbelievable. Now it seemed irreversible. There was no way to control all that fury, and he charged at the protagonist again. He tried throwing a series of attacks, but all were blocked. He shouted for Kang to fight back. Kang threw himself at the much larger man, but it didn't work, and he was struck in the back. The opponent said he didn't like him either, yet he still delivered an incredibly powerful blow that sent him stumbling backward. Spinning his leg, he managed to land a perfect kick. But back in the present, someone else using a lot of strength was the chief guard, Wang, who was smashing a tennis ball with a baseball bat as hard as he could. The goal was for the boy, who was already on the ground, to retrieve it in 3 minutes, and every time he took too long to get up and fetch it. Wang reminded him that quitting was always an option. However, Chief Wang noticed that his disciple was getting faster. It had been a month since they started training. The mad dog stared at the guard, as if to say he wouldn't just stand there either. Looking at the junk on the ground, Kang didn't know what to expect when he picked it all up. But at the very least, he had become much stronger, and when he went to grab the ball one last time, he was startled to realize that it was in the same place again. Running back, he wanted to report that he had picked up the ball and that it was still there. However, he was met by Wang, who was already wearing boxing gloves, and caught him off guard. Kang asked his master why he had punched him so suddenly. The teacher told him it was supposed to be sudden, and he said no one would warn him in advance. He stated that from that moment on, he would only notify him when training was over. He had to find the ball in 3 minutes, and when he returned, he had to attack and knock him out. And with nothing but his own body, he wanted to know if Kang was getting more precise, as he had claimed earlier, because the ball kept falling into the schoolyard. Not caring about that, he threw the ball, and Kang had 3 minutes to retrieve it. The path was already familiar. He sprinted to grab the ball. When he got there, he was caught off guard again. And so if training lasted several hours, he would retrieve the ball in 3 minutes, return, and get hit. The sun was already setting, and they repeated this for hours. The next day, everyone was in line for their meals. He was starving, having trained so much. His master was angry because he had removed the sandbag without permission. He was only allowed to take it off when going to sleep. He didn't want to listen, he just wanted to eat, while the teacher watched his disciple. Training continued, and he was constantly caught off guard. Even the mad dog felt sorry for him. Now when he ran, he didn't even think about fetching the ball anymore. He thought about the return and the need to knock out his master. He also thought it was impossible to find the ball in 3 minutes. He would run, then take a beating, and then it would all start again. He did this nearly 50 times a day, but it seemed like there was only one way out. He thought that this time he would surprise him by jumping over his head. However, when he jumped, he was caught off guard again, as his master wasn't sitting down. He had just jumped over an empty chair. Furious, he asked why he wasn't sitting. The master said there was no reason to be upset when it wasn't him being trained. He said there was no way to fetch the ball in 3 minutes, while also thinking about how to take someone down. And it had only gotten worse after he put on all that extra weight. The master told him he was struggling with athletics again. He said he would give him a demonstration from a specialist and called Ravachevsky once more. This time he threw the ball up the stairs and the dog simply jumped toward it. Then he said he knew this because he had been there once. If he crossed the street, he would reach the commercial complex. He explained that this was what happened when he arrived at school and couldn't take on his enemies head-on. Having reference points and familiarity with the area would give him a huge advantage, and he was sure he could do it. He made it clear that he never said he had to return the same way. Keeping that in mind, training resumed the next day. Now the young man seemed more motivated and determined. Even so, he still got tired easily. Using the same technique as the dog, he thought that this time he would make it in 3 minutes. Returning once again to the day that would change the protagonist's life, he was still fighting on the rooftop and had managed to land a hit on one of the leader's partners. Visibly, one of the 3 trusted allies was losing the fight, and things were taking a difficult turn. And the rabid dog, getting beaten more and more, in the end, couldn't keep his word. After taking a kick to the face, looking up and laughing loudly, he shouted that he had blocked it. But he earned the protagonist's respect, who thought he was a really tough guy. However, another person joined the fight. It was the long-haired guy, and he nearly hit Kang. Now Kang had to pay twice as much attention because fighting Moon Chan wouldn't be easy. He announced that he would take his friend's place since he was already bleeding from the nose. Kang, staring at his opponent, said it would be the same for him. No accusations, and no telling anyone. At first, Kang attempted a sequence of punches, but all were blocked. Both had great speed, as they were excellent fighters. However, Kang was knocked to the ground once again. Moon Chan, the long-haired guy, wasn't easy to deal with, and seeing this, Kane took off his jacket. He did the same, thinking it was a great idea. The long-haired guy said that he was a rising star. In judo when he was younger, Kane decided to take off his shirt as well. Their boss watched the guy taking off his shirt and didn't understand what was going on. Then, after that, he started moving in a way that left everyone around surprised and embarrassed. But back to the ruined city, where the protagonist had to fetch the ball. He thought he was clearly getting faster and also luckier in finding the ball. The problem was getting back to the shelter. He needed a shorter route than just retracing his steps. And when he returned, he was always caught off guard, no matter how much he knew it was coming. His master praised him, saying he seemed a little faster and even used a stopwatch to be sure, but he was still far off. His best time was 4 minutes and 47 seconds. All he could think about was how to shave off more time, and so the ball was launched again. He kept searching for different paths to cut down the time. When meals were served, he ran like a madman. Even the dog had more grace. And as soon as he finished eating, training started again. And once more, he was caught off guard. The training lasted until nightfall, and the next day, it all started again. He knew there was a faster way. He just needed to find the perfect route. He returned to a spot and said this was it. He just needed to jump that fence. He placed his hands on it, and when he saw the height, he felt fear. To get down, he started climbing the utility pole and jumped over the cars. But he realized that this only made it take longer. It was no different from entering through the back gate. Frustrated, when the next meal break came, he didn't even want to eat. This caught his master's attention. Kang, upset and disappointed in himself, said that he simply couldn't do it. He had just been running back and forth for weeks and had no idea how to get back in 3 minutes. He knew he needed to use shortcuts, but he found it difficult to do so while still making it on time. He also admitted that the sandbag training had made him stronger since he started using them. Then he placed his hand under the sandbag, squeezed it, and confirmed that he had indeed gotten stronger. Then he commented that the boy was just skin and bones, with no muscle for anything. Kang argued that he wasn't trying to brag, but he really had been very strong and muscular before. Wan Chang told him that the body could remember things just like the brain. The rule was simple. Take the ball in 3 minutes, and he could use any route he wanted. Even so, he was frustrated because he couldn't do it. He asked what had made him practice different sports, what motivated him. Maybe he would have chosen to study from the start. However, in the real world, true power was in the name. He explained that a person's name determined how much power and influence they would have. It was just another annoying rule, the rules of the world's game. He knew he was right when he thought back to the day everything ended for him. He was fighting on the rooftop when a teacher arrived and said that fighting was forbidden there and that they shouldn't be in that place. And, as promised, no one said anything about who started it or what had happened. However, none of them were punished, only he had to keep cleaning the drinking fountains. That was because they had someone in their group with influence, and that guy was the one whose name had power. After remembering that day, he returned to listening to Chief Wang and his advice. Wan told him that the opportunity he didn't have before, he had now, so he shouldn't complain and should just work hard. He just listened to his master's words and didn't give his opinion. Upset, he thought that he had never in his life had strong enough determination. But he wanted to save his friends, and when he said he wanted revenge on those guys, he was furious. Even though he was internally fighting with himself, doubting whether the training would work, he decided to continue. And the next day, he went after the ball again. He thought he should just jump. It was just a fence. Then he thought that if he were as strong as before and didn't have to use those sandbags, he got rid of most of them and reached the place, but it was empty. He found it strange. Neither the master nor the mad dog was there, but he felt confident. Yet once again, he was caught off guard. He said that he understood now that he was determined and that he wasn't going to cheat to win. Wang thought he wasn't feeling well, but he said he could throw the ball. He was ready. He didn't have much to lose. He had almost died once and now was living again. But if he were as strong as before, and if he didn't have that sandbag, those weren't real thoughts. They were just excuses. None of that truly stopped him from doing what he had to do. He needed to jump, and he was going to do it. So he leaped from one side, expecting to land on the other. He runs toward the place where his boss is to deliver the ball. At that moment, he trips and falls, but the boss notices that he arrived in 3 minutes and 45 seconds. So the boss asks if he is giving up on the task he was given. Thus, the protagonist gets up, looks the boss in the eyes with a serious expression, leaving both the boss and the dog confused. Holding up the tennis ball, he asks if this is good enough. The boss questions what happened to his leg for it to be so injured. With that, our hero ignores the topic and asks to be taught how to fight already. The surrounding scene is displayed again. The protagonist is shown having his leg bandaged while saying he had been suspicious of the old man since all he had trained was endurance. He says that the boss never intended to teach him anything beyond that, so Kang Yin argues that the boss promised to teach him how to fight. In response, the boss says that he knows, but it is becoming increasingly difficult. He continues explaining that he never imagined he would risk his life to this extent and considers it reckless. Despite everything, the protagonist apologizes and says that the boss is the only person he can trust. The boss reveals that the original plan was to make him give up on training but acknowledges his determination, even if it is reckless. The protagonist comments that, although the training methods are strange, they are highly effective. He had never undergone training that improved his endurance so quickly. Thus, the boss responds that the human body adapts when pushed beyond its limits. If this is repeated several times, he will become stronger. The protagonist assures that he will never give up and asks how long he should wear the sandbag. He mentions that every time he throws a punch, it feels like he is flying. Then the boss tells him to wear the sandbag even while sleeping. With that, the protagonist praises the sand training and asks if the boss has ever gone through something similar. The boss denies it, asking why he would train that way. Perplexed, the protagonist questions how the boss can put him through this without having done it himself. So the boss mentions that he knows the technique because he saw it in Dragon Ball Z. While wrapping the bandages, Hee-won comments that the reference is old to him, but explains that it comes from a famous manga. The boss jokes that it would be better if he had a turtle shell to train him, but he couldn't find one. During their conversation, they discuss the need to stand guard for 10 days. The boss promises to replace the extras, but they insist that it's fine and feel bad about leaving Captain Hee-won and the protagonist alone. The extras say their goodbyes while the protagonist trains again. He gets injured daily but is praised for his recovery. When he asks the boss if everyone knows he is training, the boss confirms, mentioning that he wasn't able to return to the bus. In the scene, the boss tells him to clean things up quickly. Curious, our hero questions how the boss managed to reach the 3-minute time by himself, and the boss responds that he simply imagined it was possible. With that, the protagonist comments that he was already aware of the challenges but questions if the task can truly be done. The boss challenges him to throw the tennis ball, and the protagonist accepts, throwing it with force. As the boss walks toward a bicycle, the protagonist complains that this isn't allowed. The boss states that there is nothing in the rules against it. Thus, the scene shifts to the school, where someone asks if he really managed to defeat an opponent. The members of a gang discuss the protagonist's strength and previous fights. They mention that he is not the same as before, but there are still uncertainties about his current state. The blonde-haired gang leader recalls past events while questioning the red-haired guy's loyalty. He orders that information be gathered about the protagonist and that someone be sent to escort the area. Back at the place where the protagonist and the boss are guarding, the two sit in silence, warmed by a fireplace. The protagonist asks if he should continue like this, and the boss confirms. While the protagonist exercises, the boss advises him to rest. He refuses and promises to give his best. Then the boss insists that he should not lose focus, but the protagonist continues training, intrigued by the bubble wrap the boss is using. The boss explains that he is making a cushion but emphasizes that he must train with a life or death mindset. However, it would be a problem if he actually died. He comments that even the smallest effort is still useful. The stage of training is shown again, with both of them carrying supplies and the boss using a flashlight. He warns that the training might end in a week, but questions whether the protagonist wants to continue. The protagonist responds that he does and asks where they will stay. The boss reveals a time chamber, explaining that it is a place used by strong people to evolve quickly. He provides enough food and locks the place. The boss explains that there is no day or night in there, and the only way out is by stealing the key. He warns that he will enter with the intention of killing him, and once the door closes, the fight will begin. The protagonist will have two options: defeat the boss or give up. As the rain falls over the stadium, the external environment and the ruins of the city are shown, reflecting the earthquake's impact. In the city, people walk through the wreckage, discussing the protagonist's whereabouts. The red-haired one comments that he took the first bus to escape the city. Meanwhile, the blonde boss reflects on the protagonist's disappearance. The shelter assistant announces the transport and encourages everyone to board safely. She bids farewell to the protagonist, wishing him to take good care of himself. The boss asks if he is sure about continuing, and the protagonist responds affirmatively. The boss emphasizes that what he is doing is dangerous and that there is still time to back out. Even so, the protagonist remains firm, and the boss wishes him good luck, showing his concern. The two continue their conversation about whether the protagonist should go to the place he intends to or not. The protagonist asks about the letter he gave the boss yesterday. The boss in turn responds that he placed it on the transport bus, while the young man thanks him and expresses gratitude for everything the boss has done so far. The protagonist begins to leave the place, but the boss calls out to him and says he will give him 3 days to return. This makes the young man happy to hear. At this moment, it is shown what he told his parents. They hear that he is fine and that he is a little late because he needs to check something first. Grabbing his bicycle, he heads toward the place he intends to go. The narration continues, revealing what he wrote in the letter, stating that he understands how dangerous things are and asking them not to worry too much. Then he says that if they find Rin's family, they should let them know she is safe and that he will take her with him, once again asking them not to worry. The dog starts following him, but the protagonist asks it not to come along, explaining that it might get hurt. The dog begins to whimper as the protagonist climbs onto the bicycle. Our hero, already on the bicycle, tells the dog to go back to the shelter. In his thoughts, he says that the dog can't come with him since there must be many people there. He continues saying that he doesn't even know if the school is safe. Pedaling toward the school, the protagonist thinks that he needs a good plan to break into that place. Stopping to rest, he opens a can of tuna and, while eating, hears a kitten mewing. He calls the cat over while offering it a piece from the can. Talking to the cat, he comments that it is a bit smaller compared to the one that used to visit his father's factory. With that, the protagonist's father appears, calling the cat over to eat and wondering where it had gone. The protagonist appears, speaks to his father, and asks if he has eaten yet. The father responds by asking if he arrived safely and says the food is not for him. At that moment, the cat appears at the spot, and the protagonist's father asks where it came from. The hero asks the same question, and the father replies that more cats show up there. Thus, the protagonist wonders why the cat has the same name as him. The father responds that it just happened naturally, and the protagonist asks if he likes cats. The father replies that he doesn't. Then the father says that the protagonist came there to earn money during the holidays and tells him to hurry up and change, warning that even though he is the boss's son, there will be no special treatment. In his thoughts, he says he is happy because his family left that place. He says goodbye and says, "See you soon." Returning to his bicycle, he climbs on again and starts pedaling, leaving the can of food for the kitten. While the cat is eating, it notices something strange and gets scared by the people appearing there, quickly fleeing the scene. These people take the cat's food can. Then once again, the ruins of the city are shown. The protagonist rides over a broken bridge, sees the hole in it, and turns back. He remembers the conversation he had with the assistant at the place and asks if she is sure. She responds that she is and that those things were not made by humans. Once again, she explains that on that day, capsules fell from the sky like rockets, and from within them, branched monsters emerged, threatening people. The protagonist comments that he has never seen those monsters out there, and she says she is not sure if they are still around or if they have already left. He pedals quickly and states that regardless of whether they are enemies or monsters, here he goes. In his thoughts, the protagonist says that he does not know how long it will take to get into the school, but the people inside need food. The elderly people who help the protagonist are sitting and eating. The old man, the husband of the woman, says that he needs to return to the Philosophy Academy now. Thus, the elderly people comment that the robbers were extremely harsh, which is why they decided to divide the food supplies. The old woman asks them to forget about it, but the protagonist continues pedaling toward the school, stating that he needs to go to the Philosophy Academy first. At that moment, he spots a child sitting on a wall. He stops and realizes that it is a little girl. She quickly climbs down from the wall, and the protagonist says hello, apologizes, and states that he did not mean to scare her. He asks if she is alone, if that is her home, and perhaps where her parents are. The protagonist, realizing that the child is not going to speak, begins to think of something. So he makes a hand shadow in the shape of an animal and asks what she is doing there and what her name is. The child then says her name is Song, and the protagonist, imitating a dog, says his name is Robakevsky. Her father appears, angry, asking what he is doing with his daughter and stating that he had already warned her not to leave the house. The protagonist explains that he just wanted to check if she was okay. Then the girl's father asks if he is talking about the wild people wandering around and if he is part of the Raincoat group. The protagonist responds that he is not part of it, but that he is talking about that group. The ruin setting is shown again, with buildings and ruins. The child's father comments that he still has a pile of food in the basement. He adds that he even went to the shelter, but bad people showed up, and the protagonist says he understands. The protagonist asks him to go to the shelter since he is struggling with his daughter, but the man interrupts him and tells him to stop talking. Thus, the protagonist informs him that he will be there for the next 3 days and asks the father to wait until he returns. Getting on his bicycle, he continues pedaling towards some store. He stops the bicycle and leaves it in a corner. Entering the store, he starts rummaging through his backpack for supplies. At that moment, he stops and notices something in the corner of his eye. What he sees is a crowbar leaning against a shelf. He thinks about taking it, but does not. Instead, he gets back on his bicycle and continues pedaling. Once again, he stops when he hears a noise coming from behind and returns to the child's house. Thus, he climbs onto a car and leaves food for the father and child inside the house. After that, he gets back on his bicycle and starts pedaling, but hears another noise. He calls out to the child, but a person wearing a raincoat appears, holding a crowbar. The protagonist is struck and falls to the ground. The three men, who seem hostile, comment that the protagonist was lucky and that he probably has more food. One of them says that if he tells the truth, they might let him go. When they least expect it, the protagonist lands a kick to one of the men's chest. Another, holding a wrench, asks what he is doing. The protagonist looks at him with a fierce gaze, climbs onto a car, and performs a backflip, striking another man. The third, wielding a crowbar, asks who he is. The protagonist says that no matter how the world is, a child should not be tormented by adults, and that this is not right. The man in the green raincoat approaches the protagonist, holding the crowbar, and calls him a son of a bitch bastard. The protagonist, in turn, jumps off the car. Then he lands another kick straight into the chest of the last remaining opponent. The three of them are now on top of the car, groaning in pain. Meanwhile, the protagonist says that he is fighting three people, but despite everything, he does not feel like he is going to lose. The three henchmen keep questioning why he cares about the people inside that house and tell him to just die. Then the three of them charge at him, saying they are going to kill him. In response, the protagonist declares that losing is no longer an option. He throws punches at the henchmen, calling one of them slow. Calling all three of them slow now, he also says their movements are predictable. He wonders why that is, questioning if it has always been this way since, at the moment he thinks, his body reacts. Then one of the henchmen still standing throws a wrench toward the protagonist's head. At that moment, he realizes it and turns around. In his thoughts, he says it's hard to explain why all of this is happening. Then he catches the object midair and throws it back at the henchman, who nearly soils himself. He feels relieved for having defeated all three without taking a single hit. Looking at the three fallen opponents, the protagonist warns them that if they cross paths again, things won't end the same way, and tells them to learn their lesson. The three henchmen get up and start laughing. One of them calls the protagonist and asks if he really thinks he has become someone just because he has some tricks, while another asks if he really thought they would leave just like that. The protagonist once again looks toward the wall after noticing strange movement from the side. Then he starts to wonder if there were only three of them. At that moment, a child appears, being held by another henchman. The man tells the protagonist not to move if he wants to keep the child safe. Licking the barrel of his weapon, the henchman says he was wondering what was going on in all this commotion and questions who the hell the protagonist is. The protagonist calls the henchman a coward for using a child as a hostage. At that moment, the scene shifts to the destroyed school. The school leader is peeling an apple. Then, the red-haired guy in a jacket appears and says that Rin came to speak with him. The leader asks what she is doing there. The redhead replies that he is going to send her back. The leader, however, tells him no, he can let her in. The redhead tells her to stay calm and not say any nonsense. She replies that she has nothing to say to the redhead and tells him to move out of her way. He questions what she's talking about and calls her trash. She then responds, telling him to move already since he's blocking her path. The school leader simply asks if she is leaving the place. She tells him yes, she intends to leave. She adds that she spoke with others some time ago, and that since then, they have never heard any strange or unusual sounds coming from outside. And despite the world still being chaotic, people want to leave and see for themselves if the outside of the school is safe or not. The leader, still peeling his apple, asks if she saw what happened on the first day of the monster attack. He says that a few days later, a group went out to check the situation outside, but there were still too many monsters, and the group couldn't even last 10 minutes out there. She says that despite that, she can see helicopters flying over the area, and that obviously means they are building some kind of rescue network. Then the leader says he has already heard from people who went outside, claiming they would return to rescue them. However, those people never came back. The leader then says, hypothetically speaking, let's say there are no monsters, but people still exist, and he asks if she has any idea what happens out there. He warns that outside there are robberies, kidnappings, murders, assaults, and all sorts of horrible things. The girl asks if he really thinks it would be like that if the teachers were still there. He asks what she means, and she says that he is happy now since he has become a gangster, the school's leader. Then she asks what he wants to become after this. She questions if he wants to become a god too. Then she asks him if he really thinks he is protecting people. The boss advised him to instill fear in his enemies, making them unable to fight. With that in mind, the protagonist delivers a powerful kick to the henchman, slamming his head against the car. The other three henchmen, upon seeing their leader in such a state, are terrified. The protagonist looks at them and declares that it's their turn to make a final decision. While crushing the henchman's foot against the car, he warns that if he ever sees the four of them in that area again, there will be no second chance. He emphasizes that no matter the method, he will do what is necessary. The child asks their father if he is okay. The man, in turn, tells his daughter that as long as she is safe, he will be fine. The protagonist, opening a medical kit, asks if they are both okay, and if the father is feeling dizzy. Even so, the man nods affirmatively, thanking him for his help. The protagonist reassures the child, saying that her father will be fine, and instructs them to be careful and wait for him. He promises to return in a few days, bringing more people to take them to the shelter, hoping they will accept going with him. As he leaves the house, the protagonist notices a frying pan discarded on the stairs. He then gets on his bicycle, reflecting on how weak he still feels. With that, he recalls the words of his boss, acknowledging that he truly is weak. He compares himself to the child's father, who showed strength in protecting what was precious to him, even without physical strength. He admits that he does not have that kind of strength. Entering a store, he states that this type of strength cannot be achieved through training alone. He reflects that even with his current strength, he would not be capable. As he moves through the store, he considers that the people at school are no longer his classmates. Then he states that they are nothing more than bad people. Returning to his bicycle, now holding a crowbar, he decides that there is no need to show mercy to such people. A panoramic view of the ruined city is displayed. The narration explains that after the collapse of society, people began to grow hostile. However, not everyone harms others. Some simply take care of themselves without becoming criminals or causing damage to society. The protagonist observes a different location. With that, he gets off his bicycle and leaves it in a corner. Using a crowbar, he starts prying open the entrance while reflecting that, although many trample on the weak, some simply avoid being accused. As soon as he opens the store, his thoughts continue. Stepping on the weak doesn't bother them, but they do everything to avoid becoming like animals. Kneeling, he grabs a gasoline container nearby and fills the power generator. He thinks that even if someone was a bad person in the old world, there were laws to punish them. He then starts using welding equipment to modify his crowbar. While working, he ponders that some people committed only a few bad acts, others many, and some went far beyond any limit. Removing the welding mask, he concludes, these differences mattered before, but now everything is different. After the collapse of the world, only two categories remain. Then he states that there are those who help, like the ones in shelters, and those who only cause further destruction. Because of that, he decides to stop differentiating between bad people, declaring that bad people are just bad people. Hours pass, and the night sky gives way to dawn. Leaving the store, he locks it and retrieves his bicycle. As he pedals, he hears a strange noise. Immediately, he grips the crowbar, but he soon realizes that it's the cat he had fed days ago. Smiling, he calls the animal over and offers it food again. Then he asks the cat if it had been waiting for his father all this time. After a moment, he gets back on his bicycle and continues his journey. Pedaling through the alleys, he reflects that he doesn't care about being judged. Even if people say he is going too far, he believes that using strength to save his friends justifies his actions. In his thoughts, he reaffirms, I won't listen to criticism from those who ridicule everything I do. Reaching another store, he begins taking notes on a piece of paper and wonders, is the world like this so people can become true villains? Leaving the store, he carries a wooden sword. Observing the situation around him, he comments on the irony of living in a ruined world. The scene shifts to the shelter. There, the protagonist's boss is reading a book while playing with the dog. Then he notices a whimpering sound coming from the dog. He wonders if the animal is bored because it hasn't eaten much in recent days. With that, he tosses a small ball to distract it. The boss sighs and comments that the animal is a bit annoying. He ends up noticing something different coming from the dog. After a moment, he realizes something is wrong. The dog collapses to the ground, and he rushes to check. Then the door of a temporary office appears in the background. At that moment, a woman appears to inform him that, although she is not a veterinarian, she has not detected anything serious with the animal. The boss asks how the dog ended up like this. The woman explains that since its arrival, the dog had injuries and was treated with saline, but there is no proper equipment for further diagnosis. The boss then looks at the lying animal and feels saddened by the situation. He leaves the room, visibly shaken, while the animal remains on the ground. In another setting, young people sit on the steps of a ruined school. One of them comments that they are lucky there are no monsters around. The chubby one states that rival groups could still appear. Another then says that they are the strongest in the area. The chubby one remarks that there will be no one to bother them, so it will be a relief. Another adds that it's sad not having phones and computers to use. At that moment, the big guy recalls that there is a cyber cafe nearby but laughs when he realizes there is no electricity. The chubby one notices something strange in the distance and asks what it is. A person approaches them, prompting the chubby one to suggest that it might be a homeless person. The chubby one suggests it might be a homeless person, and another responds that this is why they need to stay alert. They then tell the person to leave. They insist on asking if he can hear them, but the protagonist remains silent. A background character in a yellow shirt recognizes him, and just as he is about to reveal his identity, he is interrupted. In a swift movement, the protagonist lunges forward and destroys the small radio the young man was carrying. At that moment, a background character in a gray shirt appears from behind, calling the protagonist a bastard. However, before he can react, he receives a kick to the foot, followed by another blow to the face that makes him stagger. The chubby one tries to counterattack, but is struck with a baton across his back. The background character in a yellow shirt attempts to land a kick between the protagonist's legs, but the attack is skillfully dodged. Surprised, he questions how the protagonist managed to avoid it. Meanwhile, the background character in a gray shirt, with his hand in pain, tries to retaliate, shouts words of hatred, but is soon taken down by another precise strike. As the fallen background character on the stairs tries to insult the protagonist, he pulls a crowbar from his back and uses it to intimidate them further. The background character in a yellow shirt, now in shock, watches as the threatening object is brandished beside his head. He then begins to beg for help, calling the protagonist a beast and pleading for someone to save him. With an intimidating gaze, the protagonist demands to know where the other people living in the school are. At that moment, the scene shifts to a window in the school building. Inside, the group's leader sits on a bed, holding a gun, appearing focused. He soon notices something strange outside. Intrigued, the leader stands up and looks toward the source of the noise, wondering if it is the protagonist. At the same time, the school wall appears, and the silhouette of a crowbar begins to be displayed, indicating someone's presence climbing. The protagonist emerges at the top of the wall, using the crowbar for support. Realizing the intrusion, the leader grabs his jacket and rushes toward the intruder. The protagonist, determined, repositions the crowbar, ready for the next confrontation. At that moment, a view of the school is shown. Then, the red-haired guy in a jacket is also shown sleeping. Suddenly, he wakes up groggy from exhaustion. When he sees who is there, he calls out to the gang leader and asks what he is doing in that place. The gang leader then asks him to listen. The red-haired guy asks what the gang leader is talking about. Then, the gang leader responds that 30 minutes have passed, and it is not normal for everything to be so silent. The gang leader repeats that their current situation is strangely bad. The red-haired guy replies that he is not sure what he means, but that he definitely felt the protagonist arrive at the school. The leader asks where. Listening to everything the leader is saying, the red-haired guy acknowledges that the bastard is causing trouble but asks him not to worry about it. Then, the red-haired guy hears the boss saying that he wants him to gather the other subordinates and go after the protagonist, bringing him back. The leader then repeats once more, "Find the protagonist and bring him to me." Rin's friend, a girl, wakes up and asks what she is planning. Then Rin says she spoke with the school leader about leaving that place. Rin responds that, as both of them thought, they won't let them leave the school so easily. The girl replies that it must be because it's dangerous. The young Rin stands up after packing her things and tells the girl to listen carefully since she is leaving that place today. She assures her not to worry. The protagonist's girlfriend, leaving the area, says that outside doesn't seem so dangerous and that there's a possibility of rescue. The red-haired guy, putting on his jacket, complains that he was sleeping very well when suddenly Kang Lee showed up. Then he appears waking up Lee Jin-soo. The red-haired guy kicks Lee Jin's bed, who was still sleeping, and tells him to wake up. Lee Jin replies that he has guard duty tomorrow. The red-haired guy says that he was also woken up, so that's what happens. Lee goes to wake up the rest of the people, while the red-haired guy calls the other extras through the radio and asks if anything has happened. Then, the red-haired guy switches the call and starts talking to the people watching the back area, where the stairs are, asking if anything happened. He begins to shout, demanding that the people there report and asking if they can hear him. At that moment, the three people guarding the outside area are shown, tied up on the stairs. The protagonist, hiding behind a bush, wonders how many there are at once. He notes that the door is locked, there are no alleys, and no emergency stairs there. Therefore, the protagonist, who has a radio, now hears the red-haired guy in the jacket talking to those guarding the stairs and asking if they can hear him. The protagonist simply observes and listens to the entire situation. Then, the protagonist packs his things to enter the school and analyzes that there are no windows, the storage room is impossible to get into, and he questions the number of flashlights. Tying a knot in the rope, he says that maybe there is an entrance in the basement corridor of the academy. An extra, going down the stairs, asks why the guy who was sitting turned on the radio. The guy who was sitting stands up and says that he needs someone to take his place so he can go to the bathroom. The other guy replies that there's no need to call someone for that. The extra then starts yawning, feeling tired. That's when he notices someone approaching. That person is the protagonist's girlfriend, who suddenly starts running up. Holding a wooden stick, he begins calling her a bastard. Then she lands a powerful kick on the extra's chest, sending him flying. She grabs the radio that was on the chair. The extra calls her a bitch and orders her to stay put and not move. She then turns around, looking at him in a terrifying way, While kicking the guy's head, she repeats that she won't be trapped in that place. At that moment, she starts going down the stairs after defeating the cowardly extra. Then the scene shifts to where the protagonist is. He sees two people walking normally while patrolling the area. He sneaks past them without being noticed. The red-haired guy then appears, and for some reason, he is furious. He reaches the stairs and sees the state of the three people who were guarding the area. All three are defeated and tied up on the staircase. The red-haired guy, in shock, wonders if the protagonist is there, and asks where he is hiding. The other extras guarding the school area show up, calling for reinforcements. The red-haired guy in the jacket, seeing people arriving, asks if that's all they could gather. An extra then asks if he wants them to wake up the others, like Kim Ju-chang and Choi Yun. The red-haired guy responds no, that he alone is enough to handle this situation. Then he orders everyone to follow. The red-haired guy questions the extras guarding the entrance. He asks if they saw anyone pass through there. The extras reply no. Again, the extras respond that they haven't seen anyone, and they ask if something is wrong. The extras continue asking what's going on with Ta. Then, he orders them to be silent and stay quiet for a few minutes. The red-haired guy then asks the extra beside him if he can hear any kind of noise. The extra replies that maybe he sees something from up there. The red-haired guy then warns that there is an uninvited person in the area, and orders them to go and kill that person. The protagonist then throws a screwdriver toward the stair railing, making a very loud noise, and everyone listens in that place. At that moment, it is shown that he threw 3 screwdrivers onto the staircase railing. He wonders if people will come to that spot. The protagonist then asks if 5 people would be enough to start. Someone in the background starts shouting that they heard a sound coming from above. The protagonist remains mostly silent and simply puts the screwdrivers back into his bag. Suddenly, the red-haired gang appears at the scene. They start laughing, calling the protagonist a bastard, and they ask if he really thinks this is worth it. The protagonist then, holding a screwdriver in his hand, asks if Taiki has found him. Taiki, in turn, replies that he must be crazy to be there alone, calling him a bastard, and he says that it would be better if he just hid. Then he asks if the protagonist really thinks they wouldn't be able to find him. The protagonist then warns that he made the sound on purpose, and that his goal was for them to actually find him there. Hearing the protagonist's words, the red-haired guy becomes furious and orders everyone to kill him. The protagonist wastes no time and starts running through the school corridors while Taiki yells for them to chase him. Running through the hallways, the red-haired guy insults him, calling him a bastard and demanding that he stop. Behind the protagonist, 9 people are in pursuit. He then rushes toward a room and quickly enters. The red-haired guy notices and shouts to everyone that he went into that room. Confused, the pursuers look at each other, trying to understand what just happened. They struggle to open the door again, but it remains locked. As a result, they end up separated. One of them starts laughing, calling the protagonist a bastard and mocking him, claiming that he has no chance against them. The red-haired guy, irritated, says that the protagonist has forgotten how the school works and declares that he is trapped. However, the protagonist counters, saying it's the opposite. The ones who are trapped are them. Losing patience, the red-haired guy calls the protagonist stupid and explains that they are in the 4th area, where there is only one exit, the opposite door. He asks if the protagonist is really that confident. Continuing, the red-haired guy deduces that the protagonist's plan was to separate the 2 groups in order to fight them. Then he announces that everyone in the school is against him. Provocatively, he asks if the protagonist doesn't think it's a bit too much to turn the situation around. After all, it's one against everyone. The protagonist, hearing the taunts, responds calmly that changing everything might seem like a lot. However, he recalls that he has heard something similar before. With determination, he continues and states that the greatest truth among humans is that by changing one's own heart, it is possible to change the reality around them. The red-haired guy, surprised and irritated, wonders what kind of nonsense the protagonist is saying. The scene shifts after the protagonist is about to fight the school bullies. A bald guy appears behind the window. He is deep in thought, reflecting on what is happening. Then he decides to forget about it and goes back to sleep. The background characters locked in the back of the study room start asking if anyone has the key to that place. At that moment, the protagonist is using the wall to approach the background characters. One of them rushes forward but is immediately struck on the head with an iron bar, knocking some sense into him, while the other 2 stay on alert. The red-haired guy in the jacket shouts, asking why they are just standing there, and orders them to take down the protagonist. They run toward the protagonist, yelling to kill him. However, the protagonist manages to defend himself using a type of metal shield. After defending himself, he quickly lands a punch straight into one of the background characters' mouths, while the chubby one watches his friend get knocked out. Then, the protagonist immediately pulls out the crowbar and chases after the remaining guy. The protagonist then delivers a strike to the guy. The guy is hit square in the chest and screams in pain from the impact. The protagonist swiftly places the iron bar behind the guy's legs, pulling him back and making him fall. Then he quickly lands a brutal kick to his head. The red-haired guy starts yelling as he watches the situation unfold, ordering everyone to attack together. The protagonist notices the movement of the guys and grips the crowbar tightly. Still holding the crowbar, he strikes the ground, producing a loud metallic sound. With the noise echoing throughout the area, both the red-haired guy and the other background characters become more alert. Then, the red-haired guy, holding a wooden sword, says that Kang Yan is getting too full of himself and orders the others to put him in his place. Then, the MC quickly swings a mop at the red-haired guy's leg. He falls to the ground while the other extras keep shouting for everyone to keep chasing him. Without leaving any openings, the protagonist charges at them, knocking each of them out, leaving only the red-haired guy in the jacket standing. Seeing that Kang Yan's crowbar is on the ground, the red-haired guy rushes toward it. As he runs, he says he must do everything he can to take the MC to the gang leader. For a brief moment, the protagonist realizes his intention to grab the crowbar and steps on the red-haired guy's hand, making him scream in pain. Looking at the pathetic state the red-haired guy is in, the protagonist asks if he really thinks he has the strength to take him down. Then, Kang Yan turns and says he'll let him take the crowbar. He can try. With that, the red-haired guy grabs the crowbar and calls the protagonist a bastard as he charges at him. He then yells that the MC is dead. The MC quickly glances back and delivers a punch straight to the red-haired guy's stomach. The impact sends him flying backward. The hit was so strong that the red-haired guy did a full backflip before crashing onto the ground. Without wasting any time, the MC attacks again, stomping on his stomach. Meanwhile, the other extras ask if everything is okay. The bald extra, who was previously lost in thought on the bed, now appears at the scene of the fight. He asks what the extras are doing and reminds them that it's already past midnight. Scratching his stomach, the bald guy says they woke him up. The scene shifts back to the protagonist, who is now locked on the other side of the room. While the extras lie defeated, the red-haired guy calls the MC a son of a bitch. At that moment, the protagonist lets out a satisfied sigh at what just happened to the red-haired guy. As he lowers his guard, the bald guy suddenly bursts through the door using his brute strength. The bald guy immediately starts questioning the red-haired guy, demanding to know what the hell is going on and asking if the person in front of him broke into the school. Taking a closer look at the person standing there, the bald guy realizes that he knows him and asks for a moment. However, Kang Yan, not willing to give the extras time to think, suddenly lands a powerful kick in the middle of the bald guy's chest, sending him flying back. Our hero quickly starts thinking that the people he once knew are now different. He says that the old red-haired guy in the black jacket would have given up long ago. Meanwhile, the bald guy calls the MC a bitch and says he wasn't done talking. However, the protagonist realizes that at this moment, he cannot fight the bald guy while dealing with the others at the same time. He concludes that he must leave this place and face the bald guy in a one-on-one battle. The red-haired guy, realizing that the MC is trying to leave, asks where he thinks he's going and insists that there's no way out of that place. At that moment, the protagonist surprises everyone by jumping out of the window, using his crowbar to hook onto the ledge and lower himself down. The protagonist's girlfriend, who was leaving the school, hears a loud noise nearby. Suddenly, she sees someone rappelling down from a high place. The protagonist, rappelling, smashes through a window, probably on the third floor, escaping successfully as the red-haired guy watches in shock. The red-haired guy then starts shouting that the protagonist went to the third floor and orders the extras to go after him and bring him back. As the three of them rush down the stairs, the bald extra asks if that person is Kang, the protagonist. Jumping down the stairs, the bald guy exclaims that this is exciting, that he has been thinking about the protagonist for a long time, and that it's finally time to settle things. The bald guy quickly appears behind the protagonist, asking where he thinks he's going. Without wasting time on words, the protagonist keeps running toward a window. At that moment, a gun is shown. The school leader, holding the gun, aims at the other building. Observing the scene, he remarks that he can see the protagonist and wonders if he would be able to hit him from that distance. Meanwhile, the protagonist, still moving, reflects that defeating the bald guy won't be easy. He realizes that if he stops to fight, the other pursuers will quickly catch up, turning the situation into a major problem since he'll have to face multiple opponents in an open space. Suddenly, a hand appears trying to grab him. The protagonist, quick on his feet, notices the movement and lands a punch on the head of the bald guy nearby. The bald guy, laughing, exclaims that this is fun. Even so, he yells for the protagonist to stop, calling him a bitch. Ignoring the demand, the protagonist keeps running while mentally calculating how many people are chasing him. Counting 7 opponents, he realizes the situation is more challenging than he expected. The bald guy, still running enthusiastically, states that the protagonist is heading toward the rooftop, declaring that they have finally cornered him. At that moment, the red-haired guy hypes up the other pursuers, calling the protagonist an idiot and claiming he has trapped himself in a dead end. The protagonist must have forgotten how schools work. The red-haired guy taunts. Meanwhile, the bald guy, satisfied, starts laughing loudly, curious about what is to come. The pursuers, now gathered, stare at the protagonist and wonder if this will be the stage for his final fight. He, however, remains silent, focused on the red-haired guy. Turning his attention to the leader, the protagonist states that he isn't sure if the red-haired guy is really as determined as he seems. The red-haired guy, irritated, asks what the protagonist is talking about, while the bald guy watches, confused. At that moment, the protagonist shifts his gaze to the side, making the bald guy even more intrigued. The red-haired guy, alarmed, shouts for him not to do anything crazy, calling him an idiot again. Without hesitation, the protagonist climbs onto a metal bar, while the two watch in disbelief at his apparent madness. Then he jumps off the building, mid-air and landing perfectly on the other rooftop without getting hurt. And the bald guy are left speechless, stunned by what they just witnessed. The protagonist stands up and taunts them, inviting them to fight. The protagonist jumping to the other building, the red-haired guy orders the extras to go after him again, and the bald guy comments on the MC's condition. The extras by the collar, the bald guy tells him to go to his room and get the red bag. The red-haired guy, in turn, says that it's a long story. Asks the red-haired guy what else the gang leader said about this. The red-haired guy, confused, asks about what exactly. The bald guy asks if all they have to do is bring the protagonist alive to the leader. Then calls for Jin Su and instructs him to alert the other guards, telling them to be on high alert and not let anyone leave the place. The protagonist, still on the run, makes a stop somewhere, opens a water bottle, and wonders. The first one to come was the bald guy, which he already expected. The MC says he knew they would arrive quickly but regrets not being able to complete the first part of his plan. Gripping the crowbar, he states that his next destination is the hallway, the academy's basement. A friend, who had been spying on what the extras were doing, realizes that they are searching for someone. She wonders what is happening and notices that more guys are keeping an eye on the area. That way, she changes direction. Noise coming from the forest and wonders what kind of sound that is. The wall, pondering whether the extras are searching around there. Also hears a noise and does the same, hiding behind a wall while gripping his crowbar. On the other hand, spots the protagonist and starts shouting that he is there. The extra calls everyone, announcing that the intruder is with him. When finished speaking, he is interrupted by a crowbar strike to the head. Even so, he manages to alert the others. Realizes someone was watching him from behind and quickly leaves the area. Protagonist's girlfriend keeps wondering what might be happening. The scene shifts to an extra in a suit, questioning what happened upon seeing a body lying on the ground. Quickly, he thinks about the protagonist's girlfriend. Toward a location, as if he wants to find her. Grabs a flashlight, where the protagonist's girlfriend is. The scene changes, showing the outside of the school. The bald guy carries a bag in his hands. Opens the door and asks what the fat bald guy is doing with Chiyoung's backpack. He responds, saying that Chiyoung asked him to do this. He questions himself, the intruder? That must be the reason for all this noise. It begins to echo throughout the area. And the red-haired guy in the black jacket are standing in a hall along with the other extras. He, clearly exhausted, wonders where the bastard protagonist went and orders them to spread out and look for him. The red-haired guy's shoulder, asks if he's okay and points out that he was hit multiple times, suggesting that he should rest. The red-haired guy tells him to let go. He takes a deep breath, holding the air in his lungs, out a loud scream, calling for the MC. Shouting, asking where the protagonist is and calling him a bastard. Here's again, this time sitting, holding his .38 revolver while saying that he thinks the protagonist is very close to him. The protagonist plans to appear before him, and if he really came thinking he could handle them. Girlfriend head toward the school's exit, searching. Hearing all the shouting, wonders what the bald guy just said and whether he's calling for the hero. Friend starts questioning if she heard correctly. She says someone is calling the hero's name. Still shouting, demands that the protagonist come out of hiding so they can finally play some games. A rock suddenly hits him in the head. It appears behind him, asking if he was looking for him and declaring that he's right there. The protagonist tells them to keep quiet and warns them not to attack all at once. Quickly orders his goons to go after the protagonist, shouting for him to stop. Jumps over the fence, The same but crashes onto a car. The protagonist says he feels like he could run forever with these new legs he's gained. The bald guy follows suit, while the other extras chase him from the ground. The protagonist notes that even his hands are stronger than before, and the extras wonder if the protagonist is some kind of ninja and yell for him to stop. To another, the protagonist says he feels unstoppable and silently thanks the shelter chief. Now the protagonist becomes a true Parker practitioner. Falls and structures, escaping from the pursuers chasing him. Comes toward the protagonist, but his leap isn't good enough. Slam into the wall, hitting both his body and head. Stairs, continuing the chase. One of them comments that the protagonist is just ahead. But the protagonist ran toward the academy, entering through the back doors. The bald guy starts calling him a bitch, demanding that he stop running. The guy known as the Indian takes charge and suggests that the protagonist might have gone down to the basement. The black jacket, holding a flashlight, begins issuing orders. He instructs the extras to seal the front door as it's the fastest way out. Everyone agrees while the bald guy taunts, saying the protagonist is screwed. The bald guy claims that they will capture him soon and asks him to shine the light in a specific direction. And as he points the flashlight into a small room, he confirms that the protagonist isn't there. They open another door, but again, there's nothing. Sunju reports again that the protagonist isn't in that area. The bald guy yells, demanding to know where he's hiding. Provocatively, he questions whether the protagonist is scared or embarrassed and suggests a fair one-on-one fight. The protagonist observes everything. The bald guy keeps insisting, reminding him of their last fight and how they never got to finish it. The protagonist speaks up, asking the bald guy if he really wants to settle their previous fight. He mentions that in that fight, the first one to have a bleeding nose lost. The response retorts that he let his nose bleed on purpose and challenges the protagonist to fight him. The protagonist steps out from behind the door, the extra's flashlight, plunging the room into complete darkness. He starts taunting them, saying that without their flashlights, they are powerless. In this enclosed space, there are no windows for moonlight to seep in. The protagonist continues, explaining that based on his experience, it takes about 5 minutes for eyes to adjust to the darkness. He recalls how, in his first attempts, he was only able to distinguish shapes after extensive practice. Darkness, the bald guy grabs onto an extra, asking who it is. The extra, frightened, responds that he is beside him and tries to locate a flashlight. The protagonist, still hidden, warns that the pursuers will be blind for about 3 to 4 minutes. He recalls how, during his training, he faced similar situations every day, more than 12 times a day. At that moment, the text shows a flashback of the protagonist being locked in a dark room as part of a test set by his boss. He describes how the lights would turn off, and the door would be chained shut, forcing him to distinguish shapes in the dark to survive. The protagonist reveals that for a long time, he had no choice but to endure beatings because he couldn't see anything. However, over time, he developed skills that he would now use against them. Suddenly, he appears behind 2 motionless extras. The bald guy, confused, can only ask, "What?" At that instant, Sunju feels a heavy blow to his shoulder and cries out in pain. The bald guy, panicked, starts throwing punches into the air, trying to hit the protagonist, but the red-haired guy warns him that at this rate, he might end up hitting his own allies. Reluctantly, the bald guy stops attacking. In the next moment, without warning, the protagonist appears beside him and delivers a precise kick. The blow sends the bald guy stumbling back several steps, completely disoriented. The scene now shifts, leading behind the fight between the bald guy and the protagonist. In the background, someone mentions remembering the first time the two arrived there. That person is the protagonist's boss, who comments that the boy was in terrible condition when he arrived, practically dead, while helping the elderly. And in the protagonist's eyes, there was the fury of someone who could seek revenge. The boss continues, saying that the little dog was also in that cart and was in such bad shape that it looked like a corpse. With that, the boss says he didn't care much about them, as many other people had also been treated horribly in this world. The boss keeps talking to the dog alone. He says he has no idea how he got involved with a kid who just finished high school and a dog, and he comments that the protagonist's persistence paid off in the end. With that, the boss says that the dog and the protagonist are 2 completely strange creatures. He continues, saying that he doesn't know what the dog really is or what it's trying to say, but he feels like he can have a conversation with it. Then, looking at the dog The boss calls it a zombie and says that if it's going to die again, it should do so only after the boy returns. Now we return to the school where the protagonist is. With that, the bald guy starts calling the protagonist a bastard again and demands to know where he is. The scenes repeat. The protagonist charges at the bald guy and kicks him in the stomach again. The bald guy feels the severe impact of the protagonist's kick and curses at him. Everyone there is in the dark, unaware of where the protagonist is, so they start throwing punches into the air, but the protagonist dodges them all since he knows their exact locations. With that, he lands another punch straight into the bald guy's face. While beating the bald guy, the protagonist states that he already told him their fight was settled a long time ago and that there's nothing left between them. This time, the protagonist delivers a downward kick, landing it squarely on the bald guy's neck. At that moment, the protagonist exhales in relief. The red-haired guy then asks if the bald guy was hit. Trying to strike the protagonist with a few attacks, the red-haired guy calls him a rat and a coward, but all he gets in return is a swift sword strike to his hand. The protagonist, drawing his sword, asks if he even knows the meaning of the word coward. The protagonist, now landing a solid blow on the red-haired guy, says that cowards are the ones who attack elderly people who are just minding their own business. The red-haired guy, falling backward nearly unconscious, is hit again by the protagonist's punches, knocking him down. A coward is someone who beats dogs for no apparent reason. An extra, appearing behind the protagonist, asks the red-haired guy if this is the person they've been looking for. He says he's starting to understand how things work in the dark, and that he'll help the red-haired guy right away. While the extra is talking, he gets punched in the mouth to shut him up. The protagonist, now holding the red-haired guy's hand, asks which hand he used to hit the puppy with the bat. The red-haired guy just calls the protagonist a son of a bitch. Still gripping his hand, the protagonist says that he's nothing more than a bully who likes to show off in front of his friends, and that, in reality, he's a thief, a criminal, and he must pay for his sins. Then the protagonist breaks the red-haired guy's hand and says that's exactly what he is. The red-haired guy immediately starts screaming in pain. Still screaming, he cries out that his arm is broken. The protagonist sighs. Apparently, someone managed to grab something from him, and he quickly realizes it. The person in question is the bald guy, who is holding the protagonist's bag. The protagonist then elbows the bald guy in the neck. However, it doesn't seem to have much effect, as the bald guy manages to grab him and slam him to the ground. Now in control, with the protagonist's head in his grip, the bald guy asks if that's really his head, and says that, just like the protagonist warned before, now he can start to see some shapes. As he throws punches at the protagonist, the bald guy asks if he really thought all of that was enough to knock him out. Then he keeps asking if the protagonist actually believed their fight had been settled a long time ago. As the bald guy moves to throw more punches, the protagonist responds that's exactly what he thought, and that he doesn't know anything about the past, but now it's a different story, calling him a bastard. Then it's the protagonist's turn to punch the bald guy in the face again. The bald guy, hit by the protagonist's punch, says this is good and starts laughing. He comments that it's not like he has anything better to do, since there are no classes or anything like that, and asks what the protagonist has been doing all this time. Then, the bald guy grabs the protagonist and starts dragging him to a corner before slamming him to the ground. The protagonist feels the impact and begins screaming in pain. The bald guy, thrilled, quickly rushes toward the protagonist again and tackles him while he's still down. Screaming in excitement, but feeling pain in his arm, the bald guy says that all of this is about power. Stomping on the protagonist, he says that all he's done is work out, build muscle, and fight to get food. And he asks if the protagonist really thought he could beat him. Still pummeling the protagonist, the bald guy asks how long he was in there. A year and a half, maybe? And all the protagonist managed to do was tickle him. Now beaming, the bald guy starts twisting his body like he's possessed and taunts the MC, saying he should try a little harder. Then the bald guy lets out a somewhat sad sigh, saying that maybe he got too strong to finish off the protagonist, who is now completely defeated. Then the scene shifts to the outside, showing the destroyed city. The protagonist's girlfriend is climbing the wall to escape when, suddenly, the suited extra grabs her, holding onto her foot. The extra asks where she's going. She replies that if he doesn't let go, she's going to punch him, and warns him not to think that just because they're childhood friends, she's going to go easy on him. The suited extra then asks if she really needs to lead the school, and she replies that this was exactly her decision. Then the suited extra starts climbing the wall too, saying that he'll help her escape because he won't let her go alone since it's too dangerous out there. As the two of them climb, the radio starts playing. The person speaking on the radio is Mon-chan, asking if it was the protagonist who broke into the school and telling someone to answer. Both the suited extra and the protagonist's girlfriend are left speechless at what they're hearing. Mon-chan asks if the person who invaded the school is the same one they saw at the shelter last time and questions why no one is responding. The bald guy, still kicking the protagonist, asks if he's really done and demands that they fight a little longer, calling the protagonist a bastard. All the other extras are down, including the protagonist. Thus, the bald guy is the only one still standing and asks if anyone there has a flashlight, as he needs to check whether the protagonist is still alive or not. The bald guy, somewhat disappointed, says it ended too quickly and that he should have held back his power. The scene shifts again, this time back to the protagonist's boss, who is still talking to the little dog, wondering why all of this is happening. He says it doesn't matter because, no matter how much he tried to stop him, the boy wouldn't give up, and he has never seen anyone as determined as the protagonist. The boss, still sitting and reading his book, comments that even in the spirit temple room, he couldn't do anything to stop the protagonist from continuing and nearly lost. Then the boss recalls that the protagonist was beaten that day and lay there as if he were finished, as the scene returns to the fight between the protagonist and the bald guy. The bald guy, who is enjoying his newfound power, ends up being caught off guard by the protagonist, who puts him in a rear naked choke. The protagonist manages to bring the bald guy down to the ground, keeping the hold, and says that it hasn't been long since he left the hospital and questions what the bald guy has been doing. Still choking the bald guy, the protagonist says he knows someone who resembles a monster, and that no matter how strong he has become, it won't be enough. The bald guy, struggling to breathe, starts foaming at the mouth as he runs out of air. At that moment, the protagonist is caught off guard, taking a heavy blow from the red-haired guy. The protagonist is hit hard, coughing up blood. The red-haired guy, now attacking the protagonist, says that he still has one good arm to fight and that he can finally see him clearly. The bald guy, also hitting the protagonist, tells him to just die already. However, the protagonist gets up and manages to land a punch on the red-haired guy, knocking him unconscious to the ground. The bald guy, however, is still standing, and the protagonist exhales, somewhat relieved. Looking behind him, he sees the chubby bald guy bringing a bag to the muscular bald guy. The muscular bald guy tells the chubby one to throw the bag to him. Now holding the bag, the bald guy warns the protagonist once again that in this place, all he has is time. The bald guy then pulls out a nunchaku from the bag and comments that he would have preferred a fair fight, exchanging punches, but like any street thug, he always needs something extra. He says the protagonist should pick something too. At first he only used weapons for self-defense, but over time, it became a hobby. The bald guy then tells the protagonist that he can grab a weapon if he wants. The protagonist, looking at the sword on the ground, hears the bald guy say that now they can have a real fight, one-on-one, without regrets. The protagonist stomps the ground, making the sword rise toward him. He firmly grips it in his hands. The background scene changes, leaving behind the fight between the protagonist and the extras. A person begins talking about how humans possess a skill called potential, and that, in unexpected situations, they can generate something beyond the normal. The explanation continues, saying that humans have such immense strength that it allows them to save a child from a pile of rocks, as a mother once did. The person also mentions having heard a story about a man who was hanging from a carousel with his grandson and held him tightly the entire time. They comment that, at times, humans demonstrate abilities that surpass their true physical capacities. The one saying this was the protagonist's boss. He says he doesn't know if animals possess similar abilities, but if they did, he would want the dog to awaken them again since the dog has come back from the dead. The boss continues, saying that initially, this seemed irrational and unbelievable to him, until he saw with his own eyes what happened to the protagonist. At that moment, both fall silent. The dog, because he is just a dog, and the boss, because he is exhausted from talking. The extras agree that it's fine. With that, Mon Chan remembers and asks if the extras have a knife he can borrow. The extra to his right responds that he does. At this moment, we return to the fight between the bald guy and the protagonist. Fortunately, the bald guy is taking many hits, getting struck full force and spitting blood everywhere. The MC, without mercy, continues advancing with his nunchaku, delivering even more blows to the bald guy, who starts spitting even more blood. The protagonist, in an imposing stance, lands a kick in the middle of the bald guy's chest, hitting him directly and sending him flying backward. Without hesitation, Kang Yin rushes toward the bald guy with his nunchaku and attacks from above, delivering a critical hit. The fat bald guy, who had brought the bag for the muscular bald guy, appears. The protagonist, exhausted from the battle with the bald guy, starts feeling drained. Noticing this, the fat bald guy quickly realizes that the protagonist is very tired. The fat bald guy then pulls a box cutter from his pocket and charges toward Kang Yin, saying this is the perfect opportunity for him, and that if he manages to take him down, he will impress everyone else. Then he tells the protagonist to stay still. However, the protagonist simply spins his nunchaku and strikes the fat bald guy, sending him tumbling down the stairs. The protagonist drops the nunchaku to the ground and starts breathing heavily from exhaustion. Looking up, the protagonist thinks that he can't relax, as this is only the beginning. Then he begins moving toward the door. He picks up his crowbar again and starts climbing the stairs. When he opens the door to finally leave, He notices someone standing there, looking at him. Mon-chan was waiting for the protagonist and asks if the bald guy was really defeated. The protagonist remains silent. As he steps outside, the protagonist drops the bag and calls Mon-chan by name. In response, Mon-chan comments that the last time he saw the protagonist, he was just a wreck. Without hesitation, the protagonist asks if Mon-chan was waiting alone. Mon-chan, in a carefree tone, says that he wants the protagonist to give up and surrender without trying anything foolish. Adjusting his hood, the protagonist replies that it's good to find him alone. With a smirk, Mon-chan apologizes, revealing that he wasn't just waiting for the protagonist to surrender. He says that, in fact, he was waiting for the right moment to act. These words leave the protagonist in shock. Suddenly, figures appear on the rooftop, jumping toward him with nets. Watching the scene unfold, Mon-chan adds, "I'm not the type who likes to try too hard." The extras, excited about capturing the protagonist, inform Mon-chan that they got him. Mon-chan then grabs the radio and informs the gang leader that they have captured the protagonist. He asks what to do next. Meanwhile, the extras order the protagonist to stay put. Now trapped in the net, the protagonist thinks that he can't stay like this and that, if possible, he must at least take down one person before they restrain him completely. As Mon-chan comments on how much trouble the protagonist caused him, one of the extras suddenly screams in pain after being struck. Seeing this, Mon-chan quickly moves behind the protagonist, telling him to wait. Then he turns to the front, grabs the protagonist by the neck, and suplexes him again. The protagonist crashes to the ground, screaming in pain from the brutal impact. Still speaking into the radio with the gang leader, Mon-chan asks what he should do with the protagonist and whether he should take him to the main building. The gang leader responds that if the protagonist is still inside the academy, he wants him taken to the main annex and that he will be there soon. Mon-chan starts laughing and asks if he wants them to take the protagonist to the rooftop where he fell from last time. Mon-chan orders one of the extras to go help the other henchmen inside and tells the rest to take the protagonist to the main rooftop. Mon-chan picks up the belongings the protagonist was carrying and remarks that he brought some interesting items. The gang leader, sitting and listening to Mon-chan's report, comments that this time there was too much commotion and once again, a disappointment. Then he stands up and places his revolver back in its holster. The scene changes again, revealing the ruined city. A completely destroyed building appears, and once more, those aliens that invaded Earth are seen. The alien in question stands in front of a machine and begins interacting with it, inserting some kind of object into the machine, which in turn emits something. As a result, the number 219 appears on the display, with the probabilities marked at 0%. From 220 to 222, everything is also at 0%. Thus, the alien starts speaking again, stating that all objects so far show a 0% probability that the data has been sent and that it is now searching for 223. At that moment, it is shown that a signal has been received from a previously observed object. The observed object is number 19, whose probability has increased to 0.43 over time. The suited extra and the protagonist's girlfriend observe some guys carrying a person. They begin commenting that it really looks like the protagonist. The protagonist's girlfriend says that maybe it is him. They watch as the unconscious protagonist is trapped in a net. Then, the protagonist's girlfriend declares that Kang Yeon is there. The suited extra grabs the protagonist's girlfriend and asks her to wait. She then says that if it's the counter, they can fight. But he asks her once again to wait and just watch what is about to happen. Mon-chan, speaking to the extras, says that they are going up and instructs no one to pass through there. Another extra asks for help as he is struggling to carry the protagonist alone to the rooftop. Then the suited extra warns that the first floor of this building functions as a checkpoint. The protagonist's girlfriend responds that it doesn't matter how many people are there. The problem isn't the quantity, it's the fact that they are taking the protagonist. The protagonist's girlfriend starts crying, saying that he was in a coma all this time in the hospital, and that the suited extra is their childhood friend, so he should be helping him. The suited extra tells her to calm down because they can't act recklessly now. The risk of being caught would be too high. He says that he is losing his mind over all of this and no longer knows what's happening, and that this situation could spiral into something completely insane. Then, the suited extra hears a noise coming from behind. He turns around and sees that it's the messenger. The messenger then asks if the person being taken is the protagonist. He says that a long time ago he was used, and that he believes all this suffering was caused because of that. Then the messenger says that he needs to do something. He must act. He must go inside. But he is sweating in fear. Mon-chan orders the extras to put the protagonist on the ground and untie him. Mon-chan instructs one of the extras to stay behind and watch him, and for another to go downstairs to stand guard. He requests to be notified as soon as the gang leader arrives. Mon-chan is already waiting for him upstairs. Mon-chan hears a noise coming from where the protagonist is. He then looks over and asks what is happening, and also questions if the protagonist has woken up from his sleep. The protagonist, with a menacing look, stares at Mon-chan. He asks if the gang leader is coming to that place. Mon-chan, at a loss for words, doesn't believe what the protagonist is saying. Then suddenly, he realizes something and begins speaking, saying that the protagonist faked his own unconsciousness, and asks what the hell he is thinking, since he made the extras carry him there on purpose, and questions what he thinks he can accomplish with this. The protagonist, still completely tied up, manages to strike the extra in the throat, who ends up screaming in pain. The protagonist, stepping out of the net, says that there is something wrong with his body, that he trained a lot over the past month, and that there is something he can't explain. The protagonist, tearing the net in halves, says that he feels as if he could do anything he wants. Mon-chan starts laughing, calling him a crazy bastard, and asking if he really thinks he can break that net. Then at that moment, he is caught off guard as the protagonist rips the net in half. Mon-chan is left in shock by what he is witnessing. The extra who just took the hit wonders what the hell is happening. The protagonist quickly charges toward the extra, delivering another strike in his direction. However, the protagonist is pleased with his results. Grabbing something from his bag, the protagonist says that he thought about taking a break, and that he wants to rest a little more, that this night has been long and exhausting. Moon-chan is left speechless. He just watches as everything unfolds. Then the protagonist takes a can of tuna from his bag and starts eating in front of Moon-chan. Moon-chan in turn continues to watch in silence. The protagonist, eating the can of tuna, says that he's starving, and for that reason he's going to eat right there. The protagonist then tells Moon-chan that if he wants to win this fight, he'll need to follow a plan, and his plan is to take Moon-chan out of the picture as soon as possible. The protagonist says he can hear over the radio that the gang leader is just a few minutes away from the school. The protagonist's words make Moon-chan start laughing, and he says that it's been a long time. Moon-chan puts his hand to his face, asking how the protagonist can be so foolish as to think he's powerful just because he managed to break that net. Then, Moon-chan gets serious and asks if the protagonist really thinks he can stay calm after hearing that. He tells him to remember who he's talking to. The protagonist, still eating, makes a disgusted face upon hearing what Moon-chan just said, and comments that it's funny to see someone saying, "Do you remember who I am?" Moon-chan then charges at the protagonist, running straight toward him. The protagonist throws his can of tuna to the ground. With that, Moon-chan throws a punch, but he misses the protagonist. However, the protagonist dodges and manages to land a kick on Moon-chan. The protagonist then wipes his fingers and asks if Moon-chan could at least give him a minute to finish eating. Moon-chan gets angry and says, "This guy." Then Moon-chan grabs the crowbar the protagonist was using and rushes toward him. The protagonist simply grabs the crowbar with his hand, and Moon-chan wonders how that's even possible. With that, the protagonist ends up headbutting him. The protagonist thanks Moon-chan for returning his crowbar and says it's really difficult to do that. Meanwhile, Moon-chan writhes in pain. With no other choice, he starts pulling something out from inside his jacket. With that, Moon-chan pulls out a stun gun and asks the protagonist if he remembers the last time. He says that this time it will be 100% effective, and tells the protagonist to take one more step to see what happens. Moon-chan keeps pointing the stun gun at the protagonist and says he's not crazy enough to fight like the bald guy. He states that a lot of power is needed to defend oneself in these chaotic times, and says that the protagonist can't keep fighting like this. Raising the crowbar, the protagonist thanks Moon-chan once again for returning his weapon. Then he starts tying a rope around the crowbar and says that he already assumed Moon-chan was still carrying the taser with him. Thus, the protagonist successfully creates a long-range weapon using the rope and the crowbar. Moon-chan wonders what kind of nonsense he's witnessing. Then the protagonist, spinning the crowbar, says he came prepared for a ranged fight and asks Moon-chan if he's sure he wants to continue like this. The protagonist starts spinning the crowbar even faster, now tied with the rope, and asks Moon-chan if he can avoid this next attack. After the whole scene on the rooftop between the protagonist and Moon-chan, the scene changes to a messenger bringing water to the extras. The messenger asks the extras if there's anyone up there and says he will take water to the people on the top. Without thinking much, one of the extras responds that there is and tells him to go. And so he does. The messenger climbs the stairs, carrying boxes of water, while wondering if the person up there could really be the protagonist who woke up from a coma. With that, we return to the scene where the protagonist is spinning the crowbar toward Moon-chan. This time, he throws the crowbar, but the attack hits the ground. Seeing this, Moon-chan makes a worried face about what's happening while the hero speaks to him. The protagonist then asks Moon-chan exactly how much distance he needs, and also questions if he can afford to take a wrong step. Then, spinning the crowbar even faster, the protagonist asks Moon-chan where his confidence went and why he isn't advancing against him. While holding the taser, Moon-chan realizes that the crowbar is coming straight at him, and unable to react in time, he ends up getting hit directly on the forehead. Therefore, Moon-chan becomes angry about this. Then the protagonist says that Moon-chan was able to predict the movement at the last second of the attack. Moon-chan starts laughing, saying that he is surprised Kang is using this kind of trick and asks if he enjoys playing around with things like this. With blood running down his forehead, Moon-chan says that even so, the protagonist is trapped and that the only exit is behind him, and that even if he manages to defeat him, there are still extras waiting for the protagonist, warning that his time is running out. Moon-chan says that of course the protagonist could simply jump from there, but reminds him that this is where he fell last time. Once again, Moon-chan comments that the protagonist didn't realize this and asks if he really thinks he can survive a second fall. Thus, the protagonist tells him to shut up and calls him a coward, asking if he really thinks he can waste his time. Moon-chan becomes furious at being called a coward and asks how the protagonist dares to say that, declaring that he has had enough. Moon-chan quickly dodges the protagonist's attack, rolling backward. Then it's Moon-chan's turn to attack. He throws a punch toward the protagonist and says that if he lands a solid hit, it will all be over. However, the protagonist spins his crowbar and strikes Moon-chan on the back of the neck, momentarily dazing him and following up with another blow. Moon-chan begins to fall, but the protagonist hooks him with the crowbar, pulling him back toward him. Then the protagonist lands another punch on Moon-chan's neck, sending him crashing to the ground. As the protagonist walks toward him, he says he is still waiting for the punch Moon-chan promised while Moon-chan groans in pain on the ground. Still wincing in pain, Moon-chan grabs a chair and charges at the hero, cursing him again. However, the protagonist uses his crowbar to strike the chair, hitting Moon-chan as well. Once again, the protagonist delivers another kick to Moon-chan, who ends up collapsing to the ground, groaning even more in pain. The protagonist then says that Moon-chan has also trained and that he is not the type to fall easily, but it's time to put him to sleep. With no other options, Moon-chan starts saying that he will cooperate with Kang Yeon and insists that he had nothing to do with his fall that time. Moon-chan declares that he accepts defeat, admits that the protagonist is stronger than him, and says that from now on he will work for him, awaiting his orders as the new boss. However, in his thoughts, Moon-chan is already planning to hand him over to the gang leader. The protagonist then says that he doesn't need someone like him, leaving Moon-chan completely stunned and afraid. The protagonist steps closer, prepares his weapon, and says that he would never need someone like him. Moon-chan, with no way out and terrified, calls the protagonist a bastard. At that moment, the messenger, who is carrying water upstairs, is stopped by an extra who asks where he is going. The messenger asks if the extra is talking to him and says that he is bringing water for the others. The extra replies that if he had known, he would have waited for the messenger, since he had to fetch his own bottle. With that, the messenger falls silent, and the extra tells him to go ahead and take the water to the others. Then, the messenger apologizes and says that he heard a loud noise and thought everyone needed more water. That's why he decided to bring more and mentions that he already handed some out to the guys downstairs. The extra then comments that now that he thinks about it, they could use it to wake him up as well. The messenger is speechless. Then he asks what the extra means by wake him up and questions whether Kang Yeon, the protagonist, is unconscious. The extra confirms it and calls the messenger an idiot for being there alone. However, the extra realizes that the messenger was lying, questioning how he knows what's happening and reminding him that he used to be friends with the MC. The messenger is shocked as he realizes he has been found out. Kang Yeon runs toward him and says that time is running out, while Moon-chan, in turn, asks him to wait. Suddenly, another extra appears, saying that the messenger was a friend of Kang Yeon and that he was acting very suspicious by trying to go up there. That's when the extra notices that the protagonist is standing, fighting against Moon-chan. The extra asks Moon-chan what happened to him. Then the protagonist asks the same question to the messenger, who responds that his name is Yi Yeon. The messenger is happy, saying that the hero has woken up from his coma, and thank God, he's okay. With that, Moon-chan charges at the messenger, slamming his head into the ground and punching him so hard that his glasses shatter. Holding the messenger hostage, Moon-chan warns that if the protagonist moves, he will break all the messenger's bones. Starting with his arm, he orders the protagonist not to do anything reckless. With no way out, the protagonist stays silent and only mutters. Moon-chan starts laughing, saying that it was the messenger who brought the MC to them in the first place, and orders the protagonist to drop the crowbar and kick it over. Once again, with no options, the protagonist begins untying the crowbar and kicks it toward Moon-chan, who quickly pulls out his pistol and says that now it's his turn. The protagonist starts thinking that there's no way to avoid Moon-chan's attack. Thus, Kang gets hit by an extremely high-voltage shock, rendering him unconscious for a few seconds. Moon-chan, now unleashing a series of punches and kicks on the protagonist, asks how he dares to humiliate him and tells him to go to hell. Then, the gang leader appears, asking what the hell is going on, and if Moon-chan wasn't supposed to have subdued the protagonist. Moon-chan looks back, saying that it's good the gang leader has arrived and apologizes, asking for one more minute to finish off the protagonist. So Moon Chan grabs the protagonist by the hair, ordering him to stand up, and punches him in the stomach, calling him a bastard. Then, the blonde gang leader tells Moon Chan to calm down, saying that he needs to ask the protagonist something. Moon Chan replies that he just needs another minute, asking again for more time. He then starts taunting the protagonist, asking why he doesn't just turn around already, questioning if he wants to fall again, and whether it brings back any memories. The protagonist then ties the rope around Moon Chan's arm and says no, not this time. He won't need to be pushed. This time, he will be the one doing the pushing. Everyone is stunned by what they just heard, especially Moon Chan, who ends up being thrown off the building along with the protagonist. However, the scene isn't shown, as the perspective shifts once again to the surrounding area, now in complete chaos. The moon shines brightly, illuminating the ruins of the city. A machine appears in the sky, flying at high speed towards something. Wherever it passes, destruction follows. Then it finally seems to be approaching its target. It moves past a few buildings until it finally lands on another. The machine stops at the location, observing Object 2713, stating that it has not fed for 52 hours and that the current version of the human is weak. With that, the person standing in front of it responds that they would rather be left alone and do not require any rare substances. The machine continues speaking to the person in front of it, stating that the probability has increased among the other observation subjects and requesting cooperation. The person facing the machine responds that they do not care about anything it is saying and tells it to find someone else, ordering it to leave them alone. After the conversation between the alien and the experimental subject, we return to the protagonist's scene. The protagonist then throws himself off the building, using all his strength to drag Moon Chan down with him. Moon Chan, in turn, curses the MC, causing the protagonist to glare at him, completely worn out. Then Moon Chan curses him again, saying that he's finished and can't withstand any more force. As he speaks, Moon Chan also starts losing his strength, making him begin to fall from the building as well. However, the one who saves Moon Chan is the leader of the school gang. Thus, the only person who falls from the building is the protagonist. The gang leader simply watches from above as the protagonist lies motionless on the ground. The school's surroundings are shown, while a person groans in pain. That person is the protagonist. Slowly, the protagonist drags himself toward his bag, still groaning in pain. He sits beside the bag, seemingly searching for something. He starts coughing, completely exhausted, and so he begins climbing the school again, scaling walls and barriers once more. Apparently, he has arrived at his destination as he opens a nearby window and begins to climb inside. He passes through a hall that closely resembles an auditorium. As he walks, he continues murmuring in pain and exhaustion. With that, the surroundings of the school are shown at night. Once again, the surroundings of the school are displayed. However, this time, it is still morning, while someone calls for the extras, cursing them and saying they are waiting for them. Munchin, the bald guy, and the red-haired guy are talking. The bald guy asks the two if they know where the protagonist went. Meanwhile, Munchin tells him that he is crazy and asks him to rest because they will now take care of it and search for the protagonist. Munchin, looking at the red-haired guy, asks why he didn't inform them that Kang was outside, since he knew, and questions if it was his pride that stopped him from doing so. The red-haired guy does not respond, remains silent, and starts thinking about the protagonist, saying his name. All the extras are gathered in the school. One then says they need to guard the exit and keep the radio channel open, so if the intruder appears again, they can contact him. With that, the scene shifts back inside the school, where the protagonist's young girlfriend meets her friend, who, in turn, says she is glad she is okay, and asks if anything happened to her. The young girl remains silent, and in her thoughts, she recalls what the suited young man told her. She remembers that from the way things are, she assumes the protagonist managed to escape since they are searching for him so desperately, and that if she tried to help him now, things could probably get even worse. Since things are calmer for now, they ask her to wait and see how they can help the protagonist later. She then starts crying, calling the protagonist an idiot and asking how he could do something like this. Once again, the surroundings of the school are shown, this time revealing a massive destroyed warehouse. The protagonist is lying between rows of chairs, murmuring in pain once more. He is asleep, yet he continues to murmur in pain. In the protagonist's dream, he remembers the young girl from when they were children, as she tells him he needs to return the toys, and asks him to do it quickly. Still in his dream, the protagonist remembers the time he trained with her and how she helped him. She tells him to stand up, spread his legs a bit more, and insists that if he doesn't work hard, her uncle will be disappointed in her. Still dreaming, the hero is tormented by two boys. One of them says he heard that Kang started training and says he wants to test him. while the other supports his friend's idea. As one of the extras punches the protagonist, he claims to have the third fastest punch in England, and asks if the protagonist can see how fast his punch is. As the extras talk, the one hitting the protagonist gets smacked in the face with a backpack, leaving the other extra in shock. The young Rin appears at the scene and starts punching the boy who was hitting Kang Yan. She demands that he show his so-called fast punch. The protagonist then asks Rin what will happen if those two come back with more friends. She responds that it's fine because she hit them hard enough that they won't try something that stupid again, though she can't say she doesn't feel ashamed of hitting such weaklings. Then she starts pinching him and asks why he always lets these people beat him up. He replies that his father and uncle told him not to fight anyone outside the academy because he could kill them. She says that's nonsense. Then Rin asks what Kang would do without her and says it's okay, assuring him that she will always be by his side to help him. The protagonist starts waking up from his deep sleep. He gets up, sits on the stairs, and thinks that it was all just a dream. However, he was able to hear young Rin's voice again and feels that all he needs is a little more rest. Still in his thoughts, he makes a serious expression and asks if young Rin is there. It must be her. Who else could it be? He asks her to wait for him. As soon as he regains his strength, he will go after her. The gang leader stands with his arms crossed, asking if Min Dae-young already knows that the other guys have all been defeated. Min Dae-young is training, and because of that, he is covered in sweat. Then he responds to the gang leader, saying that he heard over the radio and that a long time ago, he faced the protagonist in front of the door. Even so, back then, the protagonist was nothing. He says that as soon as the gang leader finds him, he should let him know, as he will handle it himself. Min Dae-young is doing pull-ups using 2 water jugs. The gang leader says he probably knows where the protagonist is and asks if Min Dae-young wants to go with him. With that, we return to the outskirts where the alien is located. It continues stating that observation object 2713 has gone 65 hours without food. Therefore, the alien insists that he will awaken but won't survive without the proper nutrients. The alien machine, floating in front of object 2713, suggests that he eat something quickly. Irritated by the endless talking, object 2713 punches a nearby air conditioning unit. He says that his name is Kim Sung and that this is what he is called, while glaring angrily at the machine. The machine responds that it has learned his name and asks him to leave. He warns that if the machine refers to him like that again, he will destroy it. So we leave behind the scene of Object 2713 and return to the school. Now at night, the protagonist is inside, exhausted and completely battered. He slowly gets up, as he is extremely tired, and wonders how long he was asleep. This time, he comments that he feels hot and exhausted. Someone in the background says that he has been sleeping there for quite a while. Because of that, the protagonist is completely shocked upon hearing the person's voice. The person there is Min Dae-young, the one the gang leader was talking to. The protagonist, surprised, quickly stands up and says Min Dae-young's name. Min Dae-young makes a grotesque expression, probably advancing toward the hero. Before he realizes it, the protagonist is struck by a kick from Min Dae-young, who then leaps to another spot. Min Dae-young comments that it took a long time, but warns that his style is not to attack someone who is sleeping. The protagonist slowly rises, visibly injured, and asks if it is true that Min Dae-young came alone. In response, Min Dae-young says there is no need to worry because no one will interfere in their fight. Then, with a dark expression, he states that if everyone came after the protagonist, he would quickly lose interest. Hearing this, our hero sighs in relief. He positions himself for combat, taking on a fighting stance, and comments that it's good to know that. He adds that in a one-on-one fight, he can win easily. Thus, the fight between Min Dae-young and the protagonist begins. Kang throws strikes at his opponent, advancing quickly against Min Dae-young. Then he lands a kick between Min Dae-young's arm and armpit. However, Kang Yan did not expect Min Dae-young to be able to catch his kick. Min Dae-young then comments that he is also relieved because he alone is enough to defeat him. At that moment, he lifts the protagonist by the neck and slams him forcefully onto the ground. The impact makes the protagonist writhe in pain. Not giving him much time to recover, Min Dae-young continues advancing toward him. However, it seemed that this situation was part of the protagonist's plan. He seizes the opportunity and kicks Min Dae-young's knee. He quickly gets up and throws a punch aimed at his opponent's chin. However, Min Dae-young dodges the attack and, in return, strikes the protagonist's arm. The impact pushes the protagonist far back. He manages to land on his feet but shows clear signs of exhaustion. Min Dae-young praises his potential while criticizing his lack of speed. He mentions that Moon Chan and the young red-haired guy in the black jacket were too careless, making Kang laugh. Then he stands up again, sighing due to the pain and fatigue. While pulling something off his body, The MC asks Min Dae-young if he has ever watched a famous series called Dragon Ball. Confused, Min Dae-young asks what he's talking about. The protagonist begins removing several weights strapped to his body. He explains that he thought enduring hits like a punching bag would make him stronger. However, when they started adding lead pieces to the weights he was carrying, he changed his mind and thought he would die. As he adjusts the items, the protagonist mentions that his boss told him to wear the weights just like Kakarot did. The two remain motionless, staring at each other. Kang Yeon reveals that his boss instructed him to remove the weights only when it was truly necessary. Finally, he throws the sandbags to the ground. Min Dae, watching everything, is shocked as he realizes that the protagonist will no longer be the same as before. Then, the MC returns to his fighting stance and declares that now the real battle begins.
Our video ends here. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, bye bye.